Hey, Pete, have you ever been fascinated by the allure of secret societies throughout history?
Are you kidding me right now, Andy? I live for this stuff. From the Freemasons to the Illuminati, I am obsessed with these clandestine groups. The Rosicrucians and their ancient wisdom, the Skull and Bones Society at Yale with its powerful alumni network. I'm drawn to them. There's something about how they offer this exclusive access to hidden knowledge. They totally capture my imagination. It's like they give this sense of belonging to something greater than oneself.
Wow, sounds like you're looking for one yourself.
Do you even need to ask? Where do I sign? How much blood do I have to give? Are there any required tattoos or brands involved? Is it my first or second born that they need?
Well, what if I told you that there's a secret society for film lovers right here at the Next Reel family of film podcasts, all proud members of the True Story FM network, and you don't have to give any blood or either of your kids?
You've got my attention, Andy. What can you tell me about this cinematic brotherhood?
When you become a member of the Next Reel family, you gain access to a treasure trove of exclusive content, early episode releases, and a community of passionate film enthusiasts who share your love for movies. It's like being initiated into a secret order where you're privy to the inner workings of our shows, including the Next Reel, the Film Board, Movies We Like, Sitting in the Dark, and CinemaScope.
But Andy, as a member, will I unlock a world of bonus content from extended conversations and behind-the-scenes insights to exclusive pre-show and post-show discussions that expand the conversations about the films we love?
Why, yes, the true power of this secret society lies in its community. As a member, you'll join an exclusive group within our Discord community where you can engage in clandestine conversations with other passionate film fans in our members-only channels.
But what about live recordings, Andy? The sacred rituals of any good cinematic order. Will these episodes be scheduled in advance so that members like me will know when to gather around the virtual pyre in real time via YouTube?
Ah, yes. Perhaps the greatest secret of all is that by becoming a member, you're not just investing in your own entertainment, you're also supporting the tireless work of our independent creators and helping to keep the magic of cinema alive and well. So if you're ready to join this elite group of film lovers and unlock the secrets of cinema, head over to truestory.fm/join. For just $5 a month or $55 a year, you will gain access to a world of exclusive content, engaging discussions, and a community that shares your passion for movies. Head to truestory.fm/join to sign up.
Andy, I can't wait for you to welcome me into the inner circle of the Next Reel family of film podcasts. I'll see you in the secret chambers. Now, when do I get my ring?
Well, we don't actually offer rings with your membership.
Tattoos or brands? When can I do that?
No tattoos.
Secret handshakes?
Tell you what, you and I can come up with our own secret handshake, okay?
No, I mean, at the very least.
Welcome to CinemaScope, where we're about to get down with the baddest and boldest films to ever hit the big screen. I'm your host, Andy Nelson, and today we're diving headfirst into the dynamic world of Blaxploitation cinema. Born in the early 70s, Blaxploitation burst onto the scene as a revolutionary film movement with its own style and vibe. These films were unapologetic, in your face, and ready to take on the world. Join us as we strut through the mean streets of Blaxploitation, exploring the larger-than-life characters, the kickin' soundtracks, and the hard-hitting social commentary that made this movement a force to be reckoned with. So put on your finest threads, because we're about to get superfly with the most righteous films ever to grace the silver screen. It's time to get down with the power, the passion, and the uncompromising spirit of Blaxploitation. Joining me for this conversation is the Boston Globe film critic and author of Black Caesars and Foxy Cleopatras, A History of Blaxploitation Cinema, Odie Henderson. Odie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I am thrilled to have you on this. I've been really enjoying your book. It's a great look at this movement and its history and its place in cinema. Before we really get into the conversation, though, I'd love to really kind of get your background and kind of just like your understanding of this movement and really kind of that impetus that led you to actually write the book.
When I was a kid, I saw some of these movies probably earlier than I should have seen them. And to me, they were just movies. There was the important thing about them was that they had Black people in them and they showed a neighborhood that looked like the neighborhood that I grew up in or a neighborhood that I was familiar with, like Harlem. And they were exciting to me because you really can see too many black heroes on the screen when I was a little boy. They were usually, thugs on Beretta, or somebody that Kojak got shot, or somebody that Dirty Harry pointed his magnum in their face and asked them if they felt lucky. So to see black people in power was exciting to us as little kids, especially to my female cousins who were a little older than me, who had gone to see Pam Grier and would actually play Pam Grier. You're a kid, you come home and you play the games, and they would pretend to be Pam Grier. And that was just exciting to them. When I got old enough, they would show some of these films on television, they'd be cut. So some of the ones I'd seen in the theater and several more I'd seen on TV and in edited versions on New York City and independent channels when I was growing up. I worked in a video store a little bit later on. It's kind of what opens the book. I talk about my video store experience. So I'm a teenager now. I'm in college. I'm pretty much an adult. I'm about 19, 20 years old. And one of the things that kept our store open was that we had all the Blaxploitation movies. And so I started to rent them to see what was cut out of the movie, on TV, or in a case like Sweetback, to see it the first time. Because Sweetback definitely wasn't on television, and then there was no way in hell anybody was going to take me to Sweetback. Plus, I was too young; I'd be still in diapers. So I would get to watch those, and I watched them as a teenager and look at them from a perspective of a growing, coming to adulthood male. And then when I decided to write this book, I wanted to do not just the history of Blaxploitation, but a history of my experience of Blaxploitation, especially coming back to it as now an old man and knowing what I know and having a lot more life experience, looking at the movies and seeing what they told me, what I got out of them, both as a kid and as a teenager, and what I would get out of them now, and whether that was helpful or harmful to my own being. So that was kind of the impetus of writing the book, was I was really curious as to revisit the movies, and some of them I'd seen many, many, many times, but to look at them from a historical perspective, something I had never done before. And also to look at them from, well, what did this movie tell me that I see now that I didn't see then, or that I saw then but misunderstood?
I'm sure that's an interesting way to kind of approach these because, as kids, you're not thinking about a lot of that stuff. And and especially with you having moved into the world of actually becoming a film critic, like that's become your bread and butter. Like that's how you go into movies now. You're always kind of looking at it with that critical perspective. And so it probably was an interesting shift to kind of take that approach to revisit these films.
Well, I was a critic freelance before I became a full-time critic. I come from a tech background. My undergraduate education is in math and in computer science. I was a programmer. I wrote code for a very, very long time. I wrote on the side, first on my website, then on a blog, then for RogerEbert.com, where I worked for 11 years. And that first professional gig was at Universal back in 2008, I believe it was. So I was doing film criticism. I just wasn't doing it as, like you say, my bread and butter. I had tech to fall back on. And some days I miss that. But, so I was always writing. I've been writing since I was 6 years old. But what made me want to be a film critic was Siskel and Ebert, who I ran into on television about the same time. And I decided before I wanted to be Jimmy Breslin, a man on the street beat journalist, and Siskel and Ebert turned me toward movies. And so movies for me, like Scorsese, I always talk about Scorsese and I, both asthmatic kids in the New York City area who sat at home watching $1 million movie and got their education, their love of movies from the television set, and in that case from my mother, but mostly from whatever they showed on TV, because back then you had no choice. What was on was on.
Right.
And you'd watch it.
Whatever it was, yeah. No, I hear you. And, I mean, everyone kind of has a different sense of how often they get to go to the movies when they're a kid. It's really not their choice if they're going to the movies. It's usually the parental choice or some adult taking you to go to the movies. And so, like you're saying, a lot of that stuff is TV. Like you're kind of introduced to a lot of that stuff. And it's interesting you talking about just a lot of these Blaxploitation films that you first saw or other people first saw on TV, like these cut versions of it and everything. So let's jump into our conversation about this. Before we really kind of dig in, I just want to get a sense as kind of like a big picture look at this movement and just talk about why this is an important movement to discuss.
Well, it's difficult to describe what blaxploitation is. Some people look at it as a genre. Some people look at it as an era. I look at it more as an era simply because within the confines of blaxploitation, you have comedies, you have dramas, you have horror films, you have action movies, and so on. And so I looked at it when I was doing the book as an era. So from 1970 to 1978, this is the era, and these are the Black movies that were coming out. Some of them are blaxploitation adjacent. Some of them are literally blaxploitation. But blaxploitation movies have specific elements that, we'll get into that you can say are a blaxploitation movie. They have a score, a good soundtrack. It's probably sold lots of albums. They have people in the finest clothes. They have an anti-hero or a hero who is Black, who is the lead, who will survive.
Right.
And to the end of the movie, you're supposed to root for that person. And they are shot in Harlem or the Huff or Chicago or LA, places where you found Black people for the most part. And they cater to the Black youth, which was an issue that will arise because a lot of the people who were against blaxploitation were the elder statespeople, the older generation of people who were asking, why are kids going to see, Superfly?
Sure.
So the era is important because at this stage of the game, there were very few Black people behind the camera in Hollywood. In fact, there was one, Gordon Parks, who made The Learning Tree. He was the first Black director of a studio picture. Obviously, Oscar Micheaux and Spencer Williams, those people who made silent films and race films back in the day, but they were making movies outside of the Hollywood system. They were independent. So Gordon Parks doing his Learning Tree, the adaptation of his book, The Learning Tree, was kicked it off. And then you got Bill Gunn making Stop, which was never released. And then you got Ossie Davis making the movie that's on my shirt right now, Cotton Goes to Harlem, poster there. He made his film, and that movie made, for Sam Goldwyn Jr., it made a lot of money on a very small budget. And that was when Hollywood made the insane notion that, hey, Black people go to movies. Because Cotton Comes to Harlem, I don't think there's a white person in it. There's a couple. There's a Eugene Roche who plays the lieutenant in the film, but it's not geared toward a white audience at all. And they made the assumption that, instead of Sidney Poitier, who was the biggest star in Hollywood at this point, and did the number one box office tour in 1967, his movies are made more for a general audience. Until he took control of his own career, his movies are typically made, I'll be blunt, to kind of make liberal white folks feel good about themselves. And I love Sidney, and I'm not, pissing on his legacy or anything like that. But that's the general truth between Sidney of 1967 and the Sidney of 1972. You're going to get a different movie from that person. So with that said, when Cotton Goes to Harlem made money, that was when the studios decided they want to start investing in what they considered Black material. And so that led us to Shaft and led us to several other movies, but led us specifically to Shaft, which was in August of 1970 in galley form by Ernest Tideman, who wrote the screenplay with John D.F. Black, and Gordon Parks directed it. Gordon Parks, his next movie after Learning Tree was Shaft, and MGM was going bankrupt at the time, and so was Fox. So Ernest Tideman is the hero of 1971 because he wrote The French Connection, which saved Fox's behind, and he wrote Shaft, which saved MGM.
So two studios.
And once that happened, yeah.
Crazy.
Well, MGM and Fox were going to merge in 71. The deal fell through, and Zanuck fired his kid. Darryl Zanuck, that is. Fired
Right.
Richard, his kid.
Yeah.
But those studios were saved. And since Shaft saved MGM, that was when the floodgates opened for this type of material. Now, Melvin Van Peebles, who made Sweetback, in 1970, he had made Watermelon Man, which came out the same day as Cotton Comes to Harlem and stars Godfrey Cambridge in both movies. He got a 3-picture deal at Columbia. He submitted Sweetback. So, now it's 1971, so this era is starting to boom. And then 1972 and 73 are the big giant years for blaxploitation. They put Black people behind the camera, not just as directors, but as writers. They were minorities, people of color, not just Black people, working on cinematography, working on, editing and gaffing. And Hugh Robertson edited Shaft. Hugh Robertson was Oscar nominated, the first Black person to be nominated for editing. He edited Midnight Cowboy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But, Black people behind the camera brought more black people and more people of color behind the camera because the unions were all white. And we talk about Sweetback, we'll talk about how Melvin Van Peebles gets around that. But it was a very, very segregated environment. So one big thing that Blaxploitation did do was it did get more blacks and people of color in roles that were not in front of the camera.
Gotcha. So really kind of all sides of production. It provided opportunities for people. Well, let's use this. I mean, you've kind of already mentioned some of the elements that kind of were happening before Blaxploitation really kicked off, but let's just talk a little bit more about it, because I mean, it didn't appear out of nowhere. Obviously, there had been some massive social and political change going on at this particular period of time. We had the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, the Black Power movement in like the 60s and 70s, with the Black Panther Party founded in 66. Like all of this kind of was in the air that I think kind of led to all of this. Plus, you already talked about like Sidney Poitier making movies for liberal white folks to feel good in the late 60s, all kind of like pushing people to say, we want to see something else. I mean, is there more to it than just these historical contexts, or what really kind of pushed to make that shift?
Money. Hollywood has an Achilles pocketbook. I quote this all the time. There's something that Melvin Van Peebles said. Yeah. Hollywood has an Achilles pocketbook. So if a movie makes money, and you've seen this is not new, a new phenomenon. Movie makes money, they make 17 million copies of the exact same movie, hoping that lightning will strike twice.
That's the truth, yeah.
So that's what Melvin Van Peebles say. Watermelon Man was a hit. They, couldn't say no to another movie that he was going to make. He gave him a 3-picture deal. He was the first Black person to get a 3-picture deal behind the camera. He only made one movie for the studio system, which was Watermelon Man. So, it's all about money. It wasn't that Hollywood had his finger on the pulse of the Black universe saying, oh, well, they want to see movies about militants or about whatever. Nothing to do with that at all. It just had to be, in the right place at the right time. Sam Goldwyn liked Chester Himes' novels. He wanted to make Cotton Comes to Harlem. He knew Ossie Davis. He figured, let's give Ossie Davis, the ability to direct this film. And same thing with The Learning Tree. Cassavetes got Gordon Parks a meeting with the head of Warner Brothers. And head of Warner Brothers just kept saying, oh, so you want to direct it? Do you want to write the screenplay? Do you want to produce it? Do you want to write the score? So Gordon Parks, no one talks about this, but on The Learning Tree, he had just as much power as for a debut as Orson Welles did as Citizen Kane.
Wow. That's interesting. That's really interesting.
So it just happened to be that the movies made money. Had Cotton Comes to Harlem not made any money, we would not be having this conversation. My book would have been on exploitation.
Right. So another element of Blaxploitation is, I mean, with these African-American people like behind it, making these films, I mean, there really is this embrace of the culture. And I mean, that's an interesting element because especially in their pitches to Hollywood to make money and everything, I mean, they're really kind of allowed to kind of show their world, the fashion, the music, and everything like that. I mean, talk a little bit about just incorporating all of those elements, like the things that kind of contribute to the genre's, the style and the appeal.
Well, let's be clear about something. Most of these movies are made by white people. So I want to put this out that is the directing and the writing and a lot of the producing and the money, came from white executives and so on. What added to this, what made things work was several things that are occurring once you got someone behind the camera that was a person of color, what they did because they had no money. And for example, in the case of Superfly, there was a costume designer on Superfly, but 90% of the things you see in Superfly came from the actors' closets.
Ah, interesting.
And okay. Superfly, of course, kicked off this enormous fashion trend. And my mom bought me a Superfly coat and have a picture of it. I wanted to put it in the book, but it wasn't a good enough resolution because, it's a picture that's 50 something years old. And I'm like 3 years old. I look at the pimp of the playground. And so that was a necessity because the money, there wasn't a lot of money for Gordon Parks Jr. to shoot Superfly for things like that. There were also things like, as Ossie Davis talks about, showing Harlem for the first time in all its glory and all of its rundown nature as well. And something like Cotton Comes to Harlem, that was on location shooting from the on location, and you get the mise en scène of that is not something that a white producer or somebody would kind of pick up on, but Ossie Davis certainly would, and show that in the film. Put that on the screen. It's much different if you come from that environment, what you're going to show. So in the case of someone like Ossie Davis, someone like Bill Gunn, whose career was, constantly railroaded, or someone like Melvin, or Sidney, for that matter, these folks, when they got a little power, they were willing to kind of pull people with them. But for the most part, a lot of the things that were good and bad about Blaxploitation is where the money went. And that kind of leads, as we'll talk about, to the coalition against Blaxploitation and their ideas on what should be done with the money that came from these films. So I just wanted to put that out there. It wasn't some like the Black New Wave, but it was 8 million Black people making movies. With that said, there were more Black people behind the camera than there had ever been in the studio system. And granted, a lot of these movies are from Roger Corman or from AIP, but they were big. MGM did a fair amount of Blaxploitation films. Warner Brothers did Superfly and among other things. So the major studios were involved.
Did we see a similar shift in other forms of media, or was this something that really just kind of like was hitting Hollywood at this point?
Well, music is a completely different animal here.
Sure, yeah.
And the kind of merging of music and cinema in the Blaxploitation era is incredibly important, because before that, if you looked on the charts, the number one soundtrack album was, I think, A Summer's Place, which is the famous, theme from it. But it's instrumental scores that were selling. At the same time as it's happening, Motown is happening, of course. And Stax is happening in Memphis, and Motown is happening in Detroit. And you have two different kinds of Black music coming out of that. And that's a completely separate entity. What Blaxploitation did, and we can thank, of all people too, in my opinion, we can thank Melvin Van Peebles for this explicitly. We can thank Booker T. Jones from Booker T and the MGs implicitly. Melvin Van Peebles got the idea okay, I'm making this movie, I need money. So what they're going to do is they're going to make a soundtrack with the name of the movie, obviously, on the soundtrack as a marketing tool, right? You go see the album in the store. It says Sweetback's Baadassss song, and you buy it, and you're sorry because Melvin can't sing, but nevertheless, he made an album, and the album sold. And by the time the movie came out, the name recognition of Sweetback's Baadassss song was there. So we can thank Melvin Van Peebles for coming up with this idea of making a movie and having a soundtrack that isn't all music. It's songs. It's singing. It's songs. It's singles that can be put out and so on. Superfly put this into the stratosphere, this concept. So this idea of merging movies and music kind of came to be. Con Comes to Harlem has the Galt McDermott, who wrote Hair. He does his songs that Elva Morris singing and Ossie Davis is doing some of the lyrics for. And Shaft, of course, won the Oscar for Best Original Song. And you got these people from Motown and from Stax working together with Hollywood. And so this is very important. Now, without Superfly, there'd be no Flashdance, there'd be no Saturday Night Fever. But Flashdance is the movie that ensured that every single Hollywood film had a corresponding soundtrack. So Flashdance is in the 83 is the movie that really kind of said, okay, now you cannot have a movie without a soundtrack or a song. Saturday Night Fever kind of kicked it into even higher gear, but at the end of the day, Saturday Night Fever is just a Blaxploitation movie with a white guy.
Interesting.
But you have to go back to Melvin and to Curtis Mayfield for Superfly. Why I mentioned Booker T was because in my book, I make a case for the movie Uptight, which is Jules Dassin's remake of The Informer with Ruby Dee, who co-wrote the screenplay. And Booker T, it's the first movie. I said it could be the blueprint for Blaxploitation because there are militants. There's a score by a soul singer. Before that, you had scores of Duke Ellington and Quincy Jones. These are more musical instrumental scores, occasionally as a song, but not like a song score as we call it, where there's a lot of singing and music and so on. That kind of either tells a story or propels a story and so on inside of a film. So Booker T, Uptight opens with Booker T. Jones singing Johnny, I Love You, a song that he wrote that is in the film. And Time is Tight, one of the most famous Booker T compositions, is called Time is Tight because it's from Uptight. So that's why I mentioned implicitly it's the first movie that has kind of soul music propelling it.
Interesting. Okay, so well, and we'll definitely talk more about music as we kind of get into some of these movies and everything. As far as its evolution of the way that Blaxploitation evolved throughout the 70s, as you said, it had a rapid rise kind of from starting in about 70. You said really 72, 73, there was just a lot of these out there. And then you had mentioned up through about 78 is about where you see kind of the end of it with, I think in your book, you mentioned, maybe 79, like Disco Godfather, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
As far as like the draw for audiences at this particular period of time, specifically this period of time, what really kind of led to this just huge explosion of these films? Was it just, again, as you said, was it just the money that Hollywood was seeing?
Well, I think word of mouth, and word of mouth is still the best way to sell anything. You can go and you're going to trust some asshole on Twitter that you don't know, or you're going to trust your friend that says, go see this movie. Sinners is a perfect example of how word of mouth is burning down any kind of conventional notion about what makes money. I think word of mouth was a bit, because there was no Twitter back in 1972, word of mouth was the way you got people in to see a movie. You got them going to see. Also, since there was no VHS, you had to kind of jump on it. Even though movies played for years in theaters, still, it was an event to go to the movies. And a lot of times people say, you should go see this film. And they would go. But also, what I got out of revisiting these films, and something I always got out of it, was that representation. I saw a neighborhood look like my neighborhood on the screen, good and bad. My neighborhood, they were drug pushers, they were pimps, they were hookers. At the same time, there were also these church people and people just trying to eke out a living. A side hustle or two. And you got to see it on the screen, and they were the heroes of the films. They might say what you want about, Youngblood Priest. He technically still is the hero of Superfly. So, I think a lot of that was seeing a representation where you're the hero. Like, where you're going in and you're going to get an action movie where you're going to see this badass black person and you're going to enjoy that. What eventually happened, of course, is that once everything that's underground goes mainstream, it's destroyed. So Hollywood started making inferior and more inferior copies of these types of films. And as the quality, got worse, it was up against other things that were coming in at the time. I think that's kind of what contributed to the downfall of Blaxploitation. If it ended in 75, that kind of still while it was riding high, would have a happier kind of ending to the story. But of course, as we'll talk about a little later, it really didn't go away.
Yeah, right.
But The Wiz is the movie that I say in the book is pretty much what kind of killed Blaxploitation. I didn't come to that conclusion by myself. In fact, I had no idea that was going to be in the book. My conclusion was I thought that something like Jaws or Star Wars,
the big blockbusters, right? Yeah,
the blockbuster era was what killed Blaxploitation. But in actuality, Elvis Mitchell did a movie called "Is That Black Enough for You?" a Netflix documentary, which is excellent and worth watching. And I knew Elvis, and I talked to him a couple of times. I interviewed him for the Globe at one point. Here was his theory, was that The Wiz killed it, because The Wiz cost more money than Hollywood was willing to pay for a black film. It also went massively over budget. And it was not a hit, though I dare you to find me a black person my age that will not speak of The Wiz with reverence. And I pick at it because I still think Diana Ross is horribly miscast. And I don't think overall it's a great movie. But, that is completely overridden by my love of of the material.
Right. I mean, it'll be on Criterion here soon.
Yes.
And I think it speaks to the importance it has, like just something that, is important in your heart, regardless of quality. I have plenty of those movies myself that I love, that I'm just like, I probably should be embarrassed that I actually like this thing, but that's how we are.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the criticism that it faced over its time, because certainly there was a lot of voices out at the time saying that it's perpetuating negative stereotypes, exploitative, things like that. I'm just curious, like, how this plays into the tone or like the view of it at the time, and then also now looking at it all of these years later through a critical eye, like, is there still a way to apply that thinking, or has the thinking evolved past that?
Well, I mean, there are stereotypes in these films, and some films are much, much worse than others, but it's exploitation. It says right there in the title, exploitation. So you're going to see the same things you see in white exploitation movies. The issue is that it's, taking black stereotypes. Well, let me give you a great example of what was going on in 1972 when the term Blaxploitation was coined. Because Melvin Van Peebles would throw a fit if he said a Sweetback was Blaxploitation, and in a way he has a cruise right, because the term Blaxploitation did not exist until Superfly.
Okay.
Genius Griffin, the head of the NAACP, coined that term. And so Blaxploitation itself got its name in 1972. Now, Superfly was huge, huge hit. Although Superfly the soundtrack made more money than Superfly the movie, it's important to point out. But Superfly actually, in August of 1972, the number one movie of the year was The Godfather. Superfly and The Godfather are inextricably linked in history forever and ever, amen, because two reasons. One, in August 1972, Superfly beat The Godfather and was the number one movie of that week in America.
Wow.
Number two, Superfly was being protested by the NAACP Corps and Push, the Rainbow Push, Jesse Jackson's thing, which they kind of came up with this idea called the Coalition Against Blaxploitation. They were complaining about Blaxploitation movies, and the Italian groups were complaining about The Godfather.
Okay.
And, I've always said this about The Godfather. It's an exploitation movie that was directed far too well. And that's exactly what it is. If you look at Albert Ruddy's career, the producer of The Godfather, movies he produced, very pulpy things he produced. If you read The Godfather, the book, it's an incredibly pulpy novel.
Right, yeah.
So the Italians were complaining about The Godfather, saying it was negative stereotypes that every Italian person you saw was not Vito Corleone. And you have the Coalition Against Blaxploitation saying not every black person is a pimp or a drug dealer or has a gun in their afro, and so on. Now, keep in mind, this is 1972, so this is before the big, Coffee. Superfly is big. We had Coffee, The Mac, Foxy Brown, all these movies that are synonymous with Blaxploitation have not yet been made.
Right, yeah.
So we're talking about early on in the era where you have movies like Slaughter and so on, but the big and more controversial films outside of Superfly had not been made yet when they started to complain. So there's stereotypes in these films, and I think in some movies they're really, really bad and unforgivable. But at the same time, it's kind of like you think about, okay, well, they're going to brutalize Pam Grier in these movies, but, she's the hero and she's going to get her revenge. It's going to be nasty and brutish and you're going to cheer. Or, you have Superfly, which I think is its amorality makes it so complex. And that to root for Youngberg Priest is to root against the neighborhood, but to root against him is to root for the capitalist system that is making him this person. So Superfly, I said it's a citizen Kane of Blaxploitation in my book. I believe that because I think it's the most complicated of all the films. So you have kind of two things running. And in the case of Sweetback, there was a lot of articles written by black intellectuals against the film, or even looking at the film later on as myth. The most famous of these pieces is from Dr. LeRon Bennett, called The Emancipation Orgasm, Sweetback in Wonderland. It ran in September 1971 Ebony Magazine article, which I thankfully was able to dig up and read. It's fascinating in terms of how the intellectuals were really railing against this, and your typical black person like me or my uncles were going to see it and not looking at it from the perspective of, this is damaging.
Yeah, right.
But it does have, there is, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, and I don't do it in the book either. There are issues and elements that you kind of, I think, are ugly and really should be taken behind the woodshed.
In that film specifically?
Well, no, I mean in general.
In general. Okay, gotcha.
In general. There's a scene in I love Coffee. There's a scene in Coffee that is so repugnant to me that I can hardly watch it. But it's also, again, kind of twisting your arm because it's a villain. The villain is getting his just desserts, but they're so horrible that you kind of are like, kind of questioning the baying for blood that you've been doing.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, I suppose that becomes, in some capacity, the moral complexity of revenge films, anyway, as you're kind of discussing all of that. So,
yeah.
Speaking of, I mean, you had already mentioned that as you call it, kind of an era, or as I say, this movement, we're looking like at something that is incorporating elements from all sorts of genres. I mean, especially there's a lot of action, crime, drama, but what I find interesting is that how it evolves over time. It starts kind of spawning its own subgenres, I guess we'll say, like some horror films, some westerns. And I think that's really fascinating. What do you think that these added to this overall landscape of blaxploitation cinema and really kind of works to expand its possibilities? And I mean, also, I guess, is that expansion something that also kind of made it to a point where it started retracting, leading to its downfall?
Well, look at what's made in blaxploitation. Action movies we'll set aside for a moment. And there are comedies. But look at the horror movies and westerns especially, are cheap.
Right.
The art direction in the westerns, by God. You're outside. Right. There's mountains. And you get a little storefront like Blazing Saddles, like a little fake, front saloon or something like that. So they were cheap. Red Williamson made a lot of westerns, and when he took over his career and became a director and a writer of his films, he directed a lot of westerns. And Sidney Poitier, his directorial debut was a western, Buck and the Preacher, which cost more money than most westerns that we talk about in the blaxploitation era, but certainly it was a western. And he had done only one western before, but not with another, with Harry Belafonte. He didn't do that. Harry Belafonte runs off with Buck and the Preacher. He runs off with Uptown Saturday Night, Sidney's movie he made 2 movies later. So, those were cheap things, but also it's kind of like, okay, where can we plug Black actors into? What can we plug them into? And not just Black actors, but I mean in general, but in this specific case, we had too many Black westerns? Well, maybe not. Let's make a couple. Have we had many Black horror movies? Black people in horror movies before this were like the zombies that were coming to get the white folks that made the mistake of going to Africa, or, helping them find King Kong, that kind of thing. They weren't Blackula. Blackula was the first Black vampire. So I think they were kind of throwing things against the wall to see what would stick. And also getting scripts and, making the movies if they thought it was going to make money. Horror movies, in the 70s, they were somewhat money makers. You had Christopher Lee was still Dracula. You had The Exorcist. You had all these movies that were in the 70s that were making money. Westerns, not so much, obviously. And science fiction films, definitely not until Star Wars, really. So it became a question of not people saying, well, we made this Black horror movie, now let's make a Black Western. It was like, where can we plug people in and make a buck?
Yeah, sure.
But I don't think that contributed to the downfall. I think what contributed to the downfall, again, is the quality, the lack of quality. In fact, they just basically took out what was complex or interesting about the earlier movies and just left all the nasty, salacious material in it.
And I think you also mentioned in your book that the expansion of television is another element that led to kind of the downfall, because suddenly...
That was my theory, too.
A lot of Black characters on TV, yeah.
Right, well, that was kind of initially my theory, was TV and Star Wars and Jaws kind of killed it, because television, at least back then, was free.
Yeah, right.
And you were getting more Black characters who were not Thug Number 3 on Beretta. You were getting Lionel and on All in the Family, Lionel Jefferson and Wheezy on All in the Family, and then later on the Jefferson. You got Sanford and the Son. You got Good Times. You had Tenafly, which was a Black detective, was created by the people who made Columbo. You had Shaft on television for reasons only God understands. 7 episodes of a Shaft TV show. One of them had Tony Curtis on it.
Really? That's interesting.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Tony Curtis is in the best episode of the show. Someone wrote, I think Kerry Gardella wrote something. I want to try to remember what the thing was. It was like, Shaft on TV makes Barnaby Jones look like Eldridge Cleaver. It's a decent. Shaft does not get laid once in all 7 episodes of this show.
Yeah.
Not once. He's always interrupted, right? He's about to get into bed and someone calls up and needs his help.
It sounds like it turns it into a comedy bit.
Well, I mean, it becomes kind of a running joke if you're watching the show, but it was on opposite. It was a wheel. And it's so funny because Wheel back in the day, they had Columbo, they had the Mill and Wife, they had Columbo and Wife from the Cloud. So every week you would get, every 3 weeks you got Columbo, right? So that was a wheel. For Shaft, he was a wheel with Hawkins, which was Jimmy Stewart in a pre-Matlock kind of role. So imagine your little old white lady. You turn on CBS on Tuesday night looking for Jimmy Stewart. You get, the cat that won't cop out when there's danger all about instead. So there were black folks on television. And then as more black people show up, and then there's Roots, so lest we forget, there were more opportunities for you to stay at home and see that representation. Even though all these things I mentioned were comedies outside of Tenafly and Chef, there was Get Christy Love, Teresa Graves. So there were more, they're putting like a coffee type thing on television with Get Christy Love. So these things were kind of influencing one another, obviously cleaner versions. And again, television was free. So I thought that would be the issue, the impetus that kind of killed Blaxploitation, but that was just a factor.
Just one of the factors, yeah. Yeah, interesting. I think it's interesting thinking about this. And, as we talk, I realize that, there were no Blaxploitation movies playing where I grew up, in a small town.
Not even at the drive-in?
We didn't have a drive-in. We had a theater with 2 screens. It was definitely a small town. We had one theater with 2 screens and then another theater with 1 screen. So a small town with 3 screens. And it's possible, I suppose, but I grew up on all of the shows that you mentioned. Like that was really kind of my introduction to watching any black media was the Jeffersons and Sanford and Sons and Good Times. And so it's interesting that I kind of feel like I ended up missing out on any of that sort of thing. And I'm glad that now I'm having the opportunity to kind of go back and explore these areas, because I feel like I missed out on some fantastic stuff.
Well, they were influenced. Sanford and Son, you can draw a line from Kyle Comes to Harlem directly to Sanford and Son because Red Fox plays Uncle Bud. And Uncle Bud is like the precursor of Fred Sanford. He even has a scene where he argues with Helen Martin, who at one point was one of his antagonists on Sanford and Son. So these things kind of were in conversation with one another.
Well, let's take a break and we'll be right back to talk more about some of the core components, and then we'll get into some of these movies. Here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Do you like movies?
Do you like sports?
I never played that sport on the screen, but I really enjoyed how the movie made me feel.
Well then, have we got a show for you. The Adrian Moment is where my friend Ocean and I discuss the triangulation of sports, movies, and life.
We dive deep into the movies, discussing how they relate to and have affected our lives.
We will talk about why the sport matters to the movie, why you don't have to love the sport to enjoy the movie, and mine a few nuggets of meaning inside the story you may not have realized was really there.
After listening to our show, come join us for more conversations about the movies that portray the thrill of victory
and the agony of defeat.
Find the Adrian Moment podcast on your favorite podcast app and join us while we cover the sports you love and the ones you never think about.
You will never see sports or sport movies the same again.
Let's start talking about the elements that really make up Blaxploitation. Let's start with the characters. Bold, assertive black protagonists. I think that obviously that's kind of one of the main defining features of Blaxploitation films. This sense of these strong, confident black lead characters. What do you think that made these characters so compelling and iconic, really, and also that ended up challenging traditional Hollywood representations?
Well, style. I think also style and charisma. These are 2 important things. Richard Roundtree was a model before he was Shaft. He was a model. He was an actor at the Negro Ensemble Company. He came on a screen and he projected this oozes sexuality. Now, keep in mind, black men weren't allowed to have facial hair in Hollywood.
Oh, really?
It's very rare that you would see a film before Sweetback where a black person had a mustache. Nothing But a Man, the Ivan Dixon independent film, is an example of Ivan Dixon has a mustache in that film. But to Hollywood, facial hair meant, machismo meant sexuality. And unless you were going to be chasing some white woman and trying to rape her, Hollywood did not really dispense with any kind of black sexuality, male sexuality whatsoever in their movies. Even Sidney Poitier, as sexy as he was, he had opportunities to be romantic, but they never really gave you the thought that, well, Sidney is going to, take this woman to the screen and fuck her. And so Sweetback, it was Melvin Van Peebles is kind of, he's such a good storyteller, such a good bullshit artist, and such a good marketer. You have to really take what he says with a grain of salt, as wonderful as it may be. And with Sweetback was, Melvin hated every single black movie that had been made before this. They asked him, what upset you about black movies before this? And he said, everything, every last damn thing upset him. So Sweetback is him like making up for lost time, like giving you this super stud who's going to screw his way to freedom. And in a way, it's a provocation in my mind. He's got a mustache. And it's a provocation in my mind. He's like, well, you wouldn't let us have sex on the screen before. Now I'm going to just give you nothing but sex.
Right.
And he had a mustache. And Shaft has a mustache, which the one thing I wish I'd never learned when I was researching this book is that in the original Shaft, Richard Roundtree's mustache is fake.
Really?
I spent decades trying to grow that mustache. I could have just bought it. Stuck it on my face.
It is kind of something you don't want to know.
Right. And so, but Shaft was Richard Roundtree playing Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks was this character, obviously a famous photographer, who could move through the white world as easily as Shaft does. Shaft is down in Greenwich Village with the white folks and the gay people. He's up in Harlem with his people. He's able to move between those worlds the way Gordon Parks was. In fact, it's so funny because Gordon Parks' credit in Shaft comes on the screen. Richard Roundtree kind of pushes it on the screen, basically visually, if you look at it. Like Richard Roundtree turns to the screen, it says directed by Gordon Parks. And I think that's intentional. Nelson George said that Roundtree was playing Gordon Parks, and a lot of times in the way that Lauren Bacall was playing Howard Hawks' wife in Have and Have Not.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So it was all about style, about composure, how you were confident, how you were not afraid of the man. And you had to get people who had chemistry to pull this off. Stars don't necessarily need to know how to act. They need to know how to be stars.
The presence, yeah.
And have presence. Pam Grier, same thing. She won these beauty contests, including one where she had the bathing suit on backwards. That's how not a beauty person that she was. She won a bathing suit contest, but she had the bathing suit on backwards.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
You have someone who she grew up in the West. She could ride a horse. She was a tomboy, as beautiful as she was. So she was able to do all her stunts. And she had chemistry. You look at just the opening credits of Foxy Brown. It's just her modeling all the outfits you'll see in Foxy Brown. And it's just, you can't take your eyes off this person. So you need to have someone with chemistry. And of course, they had to be able to act well enough. When doing my book, I went back and I realized how versatile Fred Williamson actually was as an actor. Something I never considered before. But again, it's all about presence. And I don't think it's just for black stars, but I think it's especially important for black stars of this era because they had not really had much opportunity outside of, say, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee and Sydney and Paul Robeson, if we're going to go back even further, and Canada Lee and James Edwards, Juan Hernandez. Their presence. You had to have a look. And I think Blaxploitation is a lot about your style, about how you convey this particular coolness, this element of cool. It has to be intrinsic, I think that's the biggest kind of characteristic of Blaxploitation. That not only is the hero, the hero is a bad mother, shut your mouth. Like the song tells you.
What about the locations? I mean, we've talked about that a little bit. Urban settings, kind of that gritty realism. I'm curious, you mentioned like shooting on location. Are these pretty much all shot on location? Were they shooting on stages at points with these films?
No, I think a lot of stuff was not just for black movies, but I think in general, there was a whole John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, who was actually beloved by black and white citizens of New York. He created a fund or something to that effect to get people to come shoot on location in New York. That's why The French Connection is shot on location. That's why Shaft, the first movie, was shoot on location in January 1971, of 1971, I mean. The first movie in 1971 to be shot on location. They were asking you to come into town and shoot on location. No longer now, You know, and back in the old studio system days, you wanted Paris, they built you Paris.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You know, or in rare cases, they sent you to Paris, but still had a lot of interiors done on the MGM backlot. You know, it's much cheaper to shoot on location, believe it or not, because they don't have to build Times Square. They can just sing your ass to Times Square and shoot it there. What was happening is with Blaxploitation that I found interesting is that it's kind of a history of New York slowly going bankrupt.
You see a decline over the course of the decade.
You see it decline. So you look at the New York of Shaft, you look at the New York of Black Caesar 2 years later, and, you know, it's like, it's shoddier. I mean, it was shoddy in Shaft, but I mean, you can see this decline.
Especially as you get to the end of that one. Yeah.
And so for them to shoot black movies, they had to shoot them in places where black people would be. So they would shoot Coffee in LA or Blackville in LA. They would shoot Cooley High in Chicago. They would shoot Superfly in New York. They would shoot Uptight in the Huff in Cleveland, because that's where the black people were and that's where they lived. So you went to their neighborhood. You're going to tell a story about someone in the black neighborhood. You went and you shot in a black neighborhood.
One of the other elements, I suppose you could say, is something that's kind of a component, especially because so many of these end up being action films, is kind of just definitely some stylized action, violence, definitely kind of over-the-top stuff, along with sexuality and nudity. Are they just kind of tapping into the kind of the overall vibe of films in the 70s? Because, I mean, we're seeing this in all of films. I mean, a lot of films in the 70s. Well,
they're tapping into the newfound freedom that the MPAA gave them, although that's a double-edged sword with the MPAA. You know, on November 1st, 1968, Jack Valenti made the Go Live, made the MPAA system go live. It was GMRNX. M became PG, well, GP, then PG. And RNX. And then it's funny because the first R-rated movie is the movie Jim Brown made called Split. It's a Donald Westlake.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He plays the Parker character that Donald Westlake created, Richard Stark, I should say, created. Donald Westlake writing is Richard Stark. And that was the first movie to get an R.
Right.
Was The Split. So they were taking advantage of the newfound freedoms of Hollywood. They could show nudity, they could show sex, they could show more graphic violence. So it wasn't just black movies, it was all movies. But a lot of times, as it always happens, when a black person does it, it looks like it's 10 times worse than when a white person does it. Or when a gay person does it, it's like 10 times worse than a straight sex scene. So that kind of had the stigma of that occurring. I think that's also one of the reasons why a lot of the black intellectuals were so angry about this, because, you know, the sex scenes in Shaft are rather tame, you know, compared to, say, something like, you know, Carnal Knowledge, or, you know, some of these other movies that white people were making that may have been more sexually explicit. And I'm not saying there's not sexual explicit in these movies. There is. It's exploitation. And you're coming to see three things. You're coming to see violence, you're coming to see sex, you're coming to hear cussing. That's what happens, and you're not going to see Merchant Ivory.
A little different.
Right. So I think it was partially jumping on the youth bandwagon. Keep in mind, Easy Rider.
Right, yeah.
These movies, 5 Easy Pieces, these movies are coming out. So it's a movement that is not just a white movement, it's a youth movement. I talk about how boomers are not going to go see a Minecraft movie.
Yeah.
It's a similar premise here.
Yeah.
They're shooting movies. The average movie-going person is a 12-year-old boy. That's what Hollywood keeps going for. The 12-year-old boy. I mean, it was like that back in the day. It's like that now. So, yeah, I mean, I think they were kind of piggybacking on it, but it was just, everybody had this freedom now that you could see that you could, you know, do stuff on the screen you couldn't do in 1957.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're even seeing that like in up-and-coming filmmakers, like, I mean, you had already brought up Scorsese, but even in the films that he was doing at this time, like a lot more violence, crime, drug use and everything. And I mean, I don't think anyone's kind of labeled his early films like Mean Streets as exploitation, but I mean, it certainly is in that vibe. There's that tone to them.
Well, Mean Streets is kind of an Italian exploitation when you think about it. Look at these characters that Scorsese grew up with. They're in his neighborhood. There was crime. There was, you know, these hustlers, these people who are doing these types of things. And there's a Catholic, you know, morality running through it, like all Scorsese's films. But it really isn't that much different. You know, what's the difference between Mean Streets and Superfly? They're both Warner Brothers movies, for starters, will take place in neighborhoods about criminals. and they ask you to identify with these criminals.
Right. Yeah.
So what's the difference? And so the Italians, they were protesting against Mean Streets. Italians were protesting it like it did The Godfather. But, it didn't get as much play as like the NAACP coming after Superfly.
That's interesting because it seems like they're so similar.
Yeah.
But people will protest what they need to protest, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's start talking about the films. For this episode, we're going to be talking about 10 films. The first 5 films, Sweetback's Baadassss Song, Shaft, Superfly, Coffee, and The Mac will be on the main show. And then for our member bonus segment, we will be talking about 5 additional films, Cotton Comes to Harlem, Blackula, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, Black Caesar, and Cornbread Earl and Me. So we've already talked about it a little bit, but let's jump into Sweetback's Baadassss Song, directed by Melvin Van Peebles in 1971. This was a groundbreaking film that you could say sparked the Blaxploitation era. The film follows a male sex worker who goes on the run after beating up 2 racist cops. As he journeys through the streets of L.A., heading south to get to Mexico, Sweetback becomes a symbol of resistance against oppression. Peebles' raw, gritty, and experimental style, combined with the film's unapologetic portrayal of a black hero fighting against the system, set the stage for the Blaxploitation movement. I mean, you mentioned he doesn't like it being called Blaxploitation, but it feels like it could be of that same era. We're definitely focusing on this black protagonist fighting against this systemic racism, the oppression. How did it really kind of work to kind of establish this, I guess we'll just call it a template?
Well, I'm looking at this Sweetback's Guerrilla Manifesto, which is the book that Melvin Van Peebles wrote. In addition to doing that album, to promote the book, they wrote his movie.
Smart marketing man.
Oh, you can't beat him. You cannot undersell. You cannot beat Melvin for this stuff. I mean, as a pioneer of all manner of marketing, I mean, he's just fantastic. And he wrote this book, which includes a shooting script explaining how he made the movie. And, he decided he wanted to make this movie about, again, a black sex worker who is going to fight the man as a narcissistic character who only cares about himself, but he has this awakening of realizing that, this militancy that he can really kind of help in the black community. But for Melvin, what he was doing was he wanted to make the movie he wanted to make. And the story goes, according to Melvin, that he was out in the desert trying to come up with an idea, and he basically started masturbating, and he came up with Sweetback, which explains that there's a lot of sex in it. I suppose. So he makes this film, and of course, he submits it to Columbia, the Pictures, that is. And Columbia Pictures tells him that, we already made this movie.
What?
And they go on to describe The Liberation of L.B. Jones to Melvin. The Liberation of L.B. Jones is William Wyler's last movie. William Wyler, of course, directed Ben-Hur and a bunch of other things that people know. This is his last movie. I tied The Liberation of L.B. Jones to myself in the book because that's the movie my mother went to see the night she went in labor to have me.
Oh.
I was born the day after my mother
saw this movie.
My mother went in labor after a movie, and it was that particular film. Liberation of L.B. Jones is not the same movie as Sweetback at all. But Columbia wasn't going to put it out because, number one, it's too sex, and number two, they weren't going to pay for it. So Melvin took his script and made this movie. Now, he had to say it was a porn, because the unions were all white, and he didn't want all white people in his thing. So, but the unions wouldn't work porn. That was a no-no. They were against it.
That's his workaround.
That was his workaround. So he was able to get black and women and a whole coalition of people behind the camera that you would not normally have had behind the camera at the time. And so he makes this film, and the thing I love is that he got workman's comp because he got a sexually transmitted disease during the making of this film. Jeez. And he was able to get workman's comp, which brought him some film to finish the movie. He also borrowed $50,000 from Bill Cosby, who at the time, Melvin Van Peebles directed probably the best episode of Cosby's pre-Cosby show. He had a show called The Bill Cosby Show back in 1970. And Melvin Van Peebles' his episode is avant-garde as hell.
Oh, interesting.
Like Sweetback. So Melvin was making an avant-garde film because keep in mind, remember, Melvin's story, he started out as a cable car guy in San Francisco. He was thrown out of San Francisco because he sued for racism. He went to Paris, to France, where he learned that if you wrote a book for the French government will pay for you to turn that book into a movie.
Wow. Okay.
So Melvin learned French, wrote 3 books. One of those books became A Story with 3D Pass. In 1967, he came back to San Francisco as the honored guest of the San Francisco Film Festival, where they were going to show his film, a movie they thought was made by a white French person. And Melvin Van Peebles got a room at a hotel he was not allowed to stay at when he lived in San Francisco. So again, it's Melvin, kind of coming from nowhere and hustling and inspiring people. So Sweetback, he forewalled it because, of course, he went past the MPAA, which is why it's rated X by an all-white jury, according to the ads, which is half marketing and half true. If you did not submit your film to the MPAA, it would automatically get an X. You automatically have to put an X on it. That's the reason why X was not trademarked and caused all that shit trouble that we have with the NC-17. So technically speaking, he didn't submit the movie to the MPAA and it had to be rated X. He also sued Jack Valenti, by the way.
Did he really?
He did, unsuccessfully.
But my sense is that he did that also because it's good marketing. Yeah.
Marketing. Come on. It's where the real money from the movie is made. Who said that? Mel Brooks and Spaceballs, right?
Yeah, right.
Yogurt wasn't wrong. So he forewalls in Detroit and the lines are around the block because, again, word of mouth, best thing you could ever have. Then he opens it in New York in April of 1971. And now keep in mind, he hooked up with the Jerry Gross organization, who kind of did some of the distribution for him once the movie got traction. And the iconic image of Sweetback on the poster with his hat, which I saw at the Academy Museum, they actually have the hat.
Yeah. Oh, really? Do they?
Of course, they took a picture of it. That Melvin put that on the poster because one of the women that came out of the 4-wall screen, and 4-wall, by the way, for folks that don't know, you were in a theater and you show your movie.
Right.
They call it 4-walling. One of the women at the 4-wall screening said that she would have done anything for Sweetback when she saw him wearing that hat. So, of course, he put that image on the poster. Melvin, master marketing guy.
Yeah.
And it became a hit. And up until Halloween, which is 7 years later, Sweetback's Baadassss song was the most successful independent film ever made.
Huh. Interesting.
And so, Melvin says, I hate that it's called Blaxploitation, but to be honest with you, every single Blaxploitation movie that followed it wanted to be Sweetback. I couldn't, because it wasn't, they'd never be that daring, never be that provocative, never be that avant-garde, because it's a weird movie. I mean, forget about all of the way it's shot, the way everything, the angels and did he call them a chorus of ghetto angels, I think he calls it in the screenplay, singing in the background. It's Earth, Wind, and Fire, by the way, their first job. And here's the biggest point about Sweetback. What made it a success was the end. He lives. You do not beat up racist cops, and you don't live. Black folks always died in movies. It's just like gay people always died in movies, and they committed suicide. It's the same thing. If you're black and you went against a man, or you showed your ass in any fashion, you had to go. And so people were stunned by Sweetback getting to Mexico and getting away and threatening to come back to collect some dues. And so that threw her. But after that, it was very hard to kill off a black hero in the film. So Melvin did this as it was his biggest. He has a line when he did Watermelon Man. He cast Manton Moreland, who was in all these racist movies. He was his name of his character Sleep and Eat. But Bamboozled is kind of a mockery of some of these movies that are made that Manton Moreland was in, and Willie Best and Stephen Fetcher. I was always curious as to why Melvin cast Manton Moreland in Watermelon Man. And in his book, Melvin says, let's take the stereotypes and fuck with the motherfuckers. So he's taking these stereotypes and bending them. And he also had my other favorite thing he said, of course, profane, it's Melvin. He said, never let them realize that you're saying fuck you. So these are, Sweetback kind of goes with both of those things. And you have a black character getting away. And basically that was this 1971 America. The Civil Rights Act is 3 years old. Well, the Voting Rights Act is 3 years old, I should say.
Very new.
68. So, yeah, this is a big deal.
I mean, definitely that experimental style was, we're not seeing that much in the rest of this movement of films, but there's something about kind of that experimental nature of it that, I don't know, kind of lends to a sense of just kind of energy and, I don't know, danger, just kind of like this vibe that the whole film carries that, I mean, makes this character seem so much grander, you know?
Yeah. It's almost documentary. Like it's like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which benefits from the fact that it was shot on a low budget with these grainy, cameras, and it gives the feel of like you start itching when you watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It feels so dirty. And so, with Sweetback, it feels like it was shot on the run because a lot of it was. When they blow up that police car in the film, that wasn't licensed.
No, yeah. It
That
looked like they
when the fire department is coming to put the fire out, that's really the fire department
coming to put out. That's independent filmmaking for you, I guess.
Oh yeah, guerrilla
Holy
filmmaking,
cow.
as Melvin called it. Yeah, guerrilla filmmaking.
Yeah. Well, let's jump to same year, really, but let's start talking about Shaft. We talked about this a little bit with Gordon Parks and everything. The story of this one, John Shaft, a cool and tough PI, navigates the criminal underworld and racial tensions of New York City, trying to find the missing daughter of a Harlem mobster. With his stylish demeanor, street smarts, and uncompromising attitude, Shaft becomes an iconic figure of black masculinity and empowerment in the Blaxploitation era. The film's success proved that black-led action movies could be both commercially viable and culturally significant. We're really kind of redefining the image of masculinity here in cinema and challenging a lot of Hollywood stereotypes. I mean, this detective who is so incredibly cool, I think we're in this place where we're kind of starting to popularize it and pave this way for these black action heroes, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, all things being equal, Hollywood would have had a black Sam Spade. He would have had John Huston would have made Devil in the Blue Dress in 1941. You got Harry Belafonte doing Robert Wise's Odds Against Tomorrow in 59, which puts a black person in the noir. You have a movie called The Well, an independent film. It's basically a black film noir. But for the most part, you could get someone, a cynical actor, black actor to play, a gumshoe. But they didn't do that. They just didn't do that in most movies at all. I mean, how Cotton Comes to Harlem, they're cops, but there's a mystery involved. And with Shaft, which again, Ernest Tideman was writing the book when MGM brought the galleys to it, the Bulky Galley form in August of 70. And then Shaft started shooting in January of 71. It came out in July, the July 4th weekend of 1971, 2 months after Sweetback came out. And so you have Richard Roundtree, again, playing this character who you've never seen on the screen before. Not just a smart, wise, and cynical gumshoe, like Humphrey Bogart would have played, in the noir, or Edward Drew Robinson or someone like that would play. You also have him as being suave and sexy and kind of getting women like they do in Bogart did in his movies. And he's in Harlem, and in Times Square, and in Harlem, and in Greenwich Village, on location. So that adds to kind of the realism of his character. And you have this mystery, which kind of the mystery of Shaft is kind of the least interesting aspect of it.
Right.
Ernest Tideman writes 7 novels about Shaft, 2 of which were adapted, both by Ernest Tideman, Shaft's big score, and Shaft. South in Africa has nothing to do with Tideman's series. He wrote 7 novels about Shaft before he killed him off. And so you have this movie that's being made by MGM in New York in January of 71, and they have no idea whether it's going to be a hit or not. And you cast a charismatic hero. This is Roundtree's debut. He's 29 years old. This is his debut in film. And you have a good detective story, because detective stories were selling back then. They were still selling. So, you have that. And then you have this score by Isaac Hayes, a known commodity. As people knew Isaac Hayes both as a songwriter of songs like Hold On, Don't Comment, and a singer of Hot Butter Soul. His album was out. He had a couple of hits. He had a Walk On By. So people knew who he was. Not just black folks. White people knew who he was too. They got him to do the score. He wanted to play Shaft, but Gordon Parks was like, you can't act. So stay behind the camera. So he does what Jerry Reed does in Smokey and the Bandit, where he couldn't place the bandit on the screen, so he plays him on the soundtrack.
Sure. Yeah. That's funny.
So you have all that coming together, and then people didn't realize that it was going to be a commercial and a critical hit, and also be nominated for 2 Oscars. Isaac Hayes, first black person to win Best Song. He was also nominated for the score of Shaft, which is fantastic. And the Shaft record sold albums. It sold a lot of albums, and that also contributed to the success of the movie. Now, Roundtree Shaft, keep this in mind, he is the longest running black character. John Shaft is the longest running black character played by the same actor. Richard Roundtree plays Shaft in 3 movies, 7 episodes of a TV show, and 2 remakes.
Right. Yeah, he's in the remakes too, right?
He's in it, but he's still John Shaft. He's not a different character.
Right,
Same
right,
people
right.
mix up and think Samuel L. Jackson is Shaft.
He's his son, right?
In Singleton's version, he's his nephew, which makes sense.
Nephew. Yeah.
In the hideous Tim Story version for 2019, he's his son. And
okay.
Richard Roundtree shows up looking sexier than Samuel L. Jackson. And by the way, there's only, I think, 7 years age difference between Roundtree and Samuel L. Jackson. People forget that Samuel L. Jackson is almost 80 years old.
Yeah, right.
And his first movie was in 1971.
Was it really?
Yes. He's much older than you think he is.
Yeah, right.
But he's also cool. So Samuel L. Jackson kind of carries a torch for the attitude of Blaxploitation, which I suppose we should come back to later. But for the time being, Shaft opens 4th of July weekend. It runs for 48 hours straight at the DeMille Theater. In my book, there's a running joke, like take a drink every time I say the DeMille. Because that's where most of the Blaxploitation movies opened in New York. And in fact, in Shaft, there's a shot of Shaft attempting to get a cab in front of the DeMille Theater. So imagine you're in the DeMille Theater.
Was? Okay, yeah. That's
if
funny.
you're in the DeMille Theater and you see that on the screen, imagine the audience's reaction to that. Like you would go outside and John Shaft threw me outside trying to get the cab.
See him catching a cab.
Right. And so, when it got nominated for the Oscars and Isaac Hayes won, I mean, that performance of Shaft on the Oscars may be the blackest thing ever put on television. It certainly scared the hell out of the white Academy voters. For it to win, and the only reason why Shaft won the Oscar was because they made Isaac Hayes put lyrics on it. The reason why Freddy's Dead doesn't get an Oscar or anything like that was because in the movie, there's no lyrics. Only on the soundtrack album does, Curtis sing Freddy's Dead.
Yeah.
You can't get a song nomination without lyrics.
Sure. Well, that makes sense because then they consider it score, I suppose. Yeah.
So Isaac Hayes added, that's why it sounds like it's almost like off the cuff. Who's the man? He wrote it, but that was kind of a last minute decision.
Well, hey, it got him an Oscar. So
it got him an Oscar. So it's a damn good, it's probably one of the best songs to win an Oscar.
It's fantastic. It's so catchy.
Shaft is so influential that, for me at least, whenever I come out of the train station at Times Square, I hear Shaft. I hear that and Willie Hall said that Isaac Hayes gave him a metronome set to Richard Roundtree's walking pace in the opening scene of Shaft. And Willie Hall said he slept with that metronome. Willie Hall plays the drums and the hi-hat in Shaft. He's also in the Blues Brothers.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So
nice.
If you listen to Shaft, you watch the synchronization of Shaft, this theme song with Richard Roundtree. It's fascinating.
I mean, that again just speaks to the importance of music for the film and then really kind of for this movement because it really plays in so heavily and to a certain extent kind of like helps define the character. And I find that to be such an important part of who Shaft is because you just feel like that music almost comes from him as he's just walking the streets.
He's walking in pace with that music. Like basically, it's like the music he's guiding the music on the soundtrack for you. And then Shaft, Isaac Hayes wrote a really good score for Shaft because it really does feel like the scenes inside of Cafe Reggio. These are places I've actually been in my life. The scenes like Cafe Reggio, or when he's in Harlem and he plays Soulsville, he sees Gordon Parks and his standard cameo he's in all of his movies. Gordon Parks has a cameo in all of his films he directed. It really does sync up with Shaft. It's like Shaft is on the soundtrack and he's in the movie.
Yeah, right. Well, let's shift to the son, Gordon Parks Jr., and the film Superfly, which came out the very next year. A Harlem drug dealer named Priest aims to make one last big score before leaving the criminal life behind, but faces opposition from corrupt cops and his own inner circle. Superfly offers a gritty and stylized portrayal of urban life, the drug trade, and the struggle for economic empowerment in the face of systemic obstacles. The film's memorable soundtrack by Curtis Mayfield adds depth to its social commentary and became a landmark in soul and funk music. And we were just talking about Isaac Hayes, and we've already talked a little bit about kind of Curtis Mayfield and this soundtrack, but really just like, I mean, how does this one stand up in the kind of the echelon of great Blaxploitation soundtracks? I mean, it's got to be way up there.
I think it's a masterpiece. I out of Curtis Mayfield did a lot of scores for these types of films. He did scores for PC Action, for Claudine, for Sparkle. And he did a lot of soundtracks at this era. So Motown and Stax and Curtis Mayfield's company were really involved in a lot of these films. You got Motown almost became a de facto label for Blaxploitation soundtracks. But what Curtis Mayfield's doing in Superfly is something that no other score on Blaxploitation, in my opinion, does. Superfly, whereas Shaft is kind of controlling the soundtrack, basically, if you think about it, John Shaft is controlling the soundtrack.
Yeah.
Younger Priest is not. So Younger Priest, the soundtrack of Superfly is fascinating in that a lot of times it's arguing with the movie. It's in direct, a contrapuntal kind of narration. So you have Charles McGregor, who's in Blazing Saddles. He's Freddy. He's the dead Freddy, and Freddy's dead. And, you see him, he dies. He gets hit by a car, if I'm not mistaken. But on the soundtrack, if you listen to the soundtrack album, what is Curtis Mayfield telling you? A Freddy's on the corner now. If you want to be a junkie, just remember Freddy's dead. Or Pusher Man, which Curtis Mayfield is in Superfly, and he sings Pusher Man in the obligatory Blaxploitation club number. Because every Blaxploitation movie needs one. Gotta have somebody going to a club, somebody singing.
Yeah.
This is another rule of Blaxploitation. They gotta have one. I'm gonna do sucker skewers that hilariously. But you go in and Pusher Man, the lyrics of Pusher Man, they serve two purposes. It's odd because Curtis was such a religious person, and he's singing such a dirty soundtrack. I mean, not that he wouldn't know about this. He came from Chicago, for God's sake, grew up in the projects. He's singing about something he would have some knowledge of. But you just kind of jarring to hear him, say, baddest bitches in the bed. But you listen to that song, and it's a taunt. It's a brag, but it's also a taunt. It's basically saying, if you buy drugs from me, I own you. So it's going in complete opposite of what you're seeing on the screen. Curtis is in your ear, kind of saying, you may not want to do that. He's, in a way, the Superfly soundtrack, at some points, is the moral conscience of the film, which is completely different than, say, Shaft. But also, Superfly soundtrack came out before the movies. So Freddy's Dead was a hit before the movie came out. So there's no lyrics to Freddy's Dead. You just hear the music in Superfly. But I guarantee you, everybody was singing it in their head by this point. And again, Superfly, the soundtrack, made more money than Superfly, the movie did. But if you listen to Superfly, the soundtrack, and I believe the tracks on the soundtrack are in order. You hear them in the same order that you hear them in the movie. It's building kind of on this particular type of story. And Superfly, again, I think it's the best in terms of quality Blaxploitation film. I think it has a good script. It's well acted by Ron O'Neal and a lot of other folks that are in it. Julius Harris is in it. It's, again, a moral that's complicated because Younger Priest, is he a hero? Is he the anti-hero? You're conflicted as to whether or not you should go for him because he's a capitalist nightmare. He says, Carl Lee says, we already have something like $700,000 in the bank, in our safe. And Youngblood wants a cool million, he'll get out. And how does he get that cool million? He's going to sell drugs to people in his neighborhood. Cocaine. And cocaine was, popular back then. That leads to the most controversial sequence of Superfly, which is what really got the NAACP's gander up, that brilliantly edited montage of people doing cocaine to Pusher Man. And Gordon Parks Jr., like his father, was a photographer. So that montage is incredibly powerful. And the remake of Superfly, which is not bad, they give you the same montage, but the montage is of people selling the drug as opposed to enjoying the drug. So all the immorality of the remake of Superfly is lost.
Yeah.
You're watching this on the screen, and it's basically saying, it's not just black, white people are enjoying the cocaine too. But you keep in mind that the whole plot of Superfly is a black person to get out of this, to make one last score, he's going to basically sell out the neighborhood. And you have to kind of live with that. And I think it's very well put together. The sequel, Ron O'Neal said he got more people complaining to him so much that they complained to him more than like he had done crimes like Nixon, he said. So they made a sequel to Superfly TNT, which is the one movie I had never seen. One of the 3 movies that I read about that I had never seen. I had to buy it. It cost me $72.
Oof. Jeez.
It's terrible.
eBay.
Ron O'Neal directed it, and basically everything about Superfly, the first one, is missing. And it's written by Alex Haley.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
okay.
Shaft goes to Africa, so does Superfly. So does Younger Priest. They both go to Africa in 73. it's this like moral picture, and it's so boring. He's off of cocaine, they're selling cocaine. It's boring.
Wow, what
so boring.
Strange shift to kind of like take the film in that direction.
Well, I understand why they did it, because they want to take the heat off of. Remember, Superfly is the reason why Blaxploitation is coined Blaxploitation.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, speaking to that point, I mean, one of the narratives is, you've got this criminal anti-hero who's really kind of like challenging the narrative, the mainstream narratives. But I mean, it's speaking to limited opportunities, I guess, to African Americans in the early 70s.
Yeah. And so basically, again, like I said, if you're rooting against him, you're rooting for the capitalist machine that made him sell drugs in the first place. So the movie it's sticky. And that's what I found interesting about it, in that it's, of all the movies that were made, there's complexity to it. Now, after that, you get Coffee, which is, of course, an anti-drug movie, very virally anti-drug movie. And a lot of films that would go after Superfly would kind of deliver a message that drugs are bad.
Right. Yeah. Well, you mentioned it, so let's start talking about Coffee, 1973, directed by Jack Hill. The story, a nurse named Coffee seeks revenge against the drug dealers and corrupt officials responsible for her sister's addiction and her boyfriend's death. Pam Grier's iconic performance as Coffee helped establish her as the undisputed queen of blaxploitation, showcasing a strong, assertive black woman who takes on the system and fights for justice. The film also addresses serious issues such as drug abuse and corruption within black communities. I mean, we were just talking about that, and here we are. Now we're on the other side of that with this revenge story, someone coming at the system that has affected her directly by kind of corrupting her sister.
Here's the thing that people forget. Coffee is a nurse.
Right.
In fact, Coffee is short for Coffin. Her last name is Coffin.
Yeah, which is an interesting last name.
Yeah, I don't know anybody that last name is Coffin. That's where Coffee comes from. And so you have, Roy Ayers, the famous, jazz vibraphonist, singing the soundtrack for Coffee. You have Pam Grier. But keep in mind, before, Pam Grier is not a new commodity in Hollywood. At this point, she was in The Big Dollhouse, The Big Birdcage. She had done Black Mama, White Mama, the Jonathan Demme screenplay of its story that had her and Margaret Markoff, who I think is one of her best co-stars, and I wish they made more movies together. So this is her first lead. And she had done a movie before this. You mentioned earlier about genres and subgenres of blaxploitation. There's a whole series of remakes in blaxploitation. And the movie that she was in before this was a remake of Get Carter, called Hitman, with Bernie Casey. The greatest poster in all of blaxploitation is Hitman's poster. Hitman is an unbelievably violent film, but then Get Carter is violent, and so is the source material. Pam Grier is fed to a lion in that movie.
Wow. Okay.
This is the last time Pam Grier will die in the blaxploitation era.
Really? Okay.
She dies in Twilight People, but she's a half panther, half woman. I think that comes between Hitman and Coffee. But after Coffee, you couldn't kill Pam Grier in a movie. That the audience was not going to stand, but they would riot. But Coffee was the first lead, and Coffee also opened up the market for female heroes, not just black female heroes, but women in general, coming at the system with guns a-blazing. Coffee is one of the most violent of the blaxploitation movies. I mean, it begins with her blowing somebody's head off, clean off.
Right.
And it's a nasty piece of work. I think it's a great movie, but I think it's violent. And she's more violent than most of the men in blaxploitation. I mean, she's coming at you with everything. And her revenge, as you say, it's a revenge movie. And she means it. She's coming after everybody. She's going to shoot you. She's going to do, there's no logic behind it. Where does she get this giant shotgun at the beginning of the movie? How does she sneak that into the guy's house? But
right.
You don't care. And then also on top of that, Pam Grier has presence and she can act. So you do feel like when her boyfriend betrays her, you feel you want her to shoot his ass, and Coffee ends on a note that you could either read as triumphant or depressing.
Or tragic. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
She's walking off into the sunset, basically, like a Western. Roy Ayers is singing about how righteous she is. But I'm like, well, basically, everybody that she loved is either dead or has betrayed her or she's killed them. So you're like, okay. But that kind of kicked it up. Coffee was a huge hit. Cleopatra Jones, which came out the same year with Tamara Dobson, I should say, but made more money by $1 million than Coffee, but Cleopatra Jones is rated PG. And Coffee is a very hard R.
Oh, very R, yeah.
And so, so Pam Grier and Tamara Dobson had kind of kicked off the Black female action hero, but not just that, the action hero for women in general got a big boost, white women regardless, with that. And of course, Cleopatra Jones has Shelley Winters as one of my favorite Shelley performances as Mommy, the villain in Cleopatra Jones, who beats the hell out of people. I mean, she's tough in that movie. And she's dressed like a drag queen. It's awesome. I love it. But I bring up Tamara Dobson simply because these were two movies that were in competition with one another in 1973. And again, Cleopatra Jones won by virtue of being PG. And Max Julian wrote Cleopatra Jones, which will segue into the next movie we're probably going to talk about, which is The Mac.
Really?
But the two of them, I want to kind of mention this before we jump to The Mac. Pam Grier and Tamara Dobson made more money in their movies than a lot of white actors in 1973. So Pam Grier got the idea, why don't I do a movie with Tamara Dobson? Because they were like trying to start some shit saying that she and Tamara had a rivalry, but they were next door neighbors. They'd been friends since 1969. Pam Grier wrote a letter to Ebony, like ripping her, reading them for filth about this. But she wanted to make a movie where she and Tamara Dobson do like a Thelma and Louise.
Okay, interesting.
This is almost 20 years before Thelma and Louise. And the studios would not bite. And so there's several movies that never got made that I always pour a little bit of liquor out in my book for. And that's one of them. Could you imagine? Like, it would have been so groundbreaking to have two women in an action film leading the action movie. Never happened.
Wow. Yeah, it almost is one of those scripts that you'd love to. I mean, it'd be a totally different tone and everything, but to see somebody take it and do something with it, yeah.
The cinematic world would be different if that had happened and it was a hit.
Yeah, right. No kidding. I want to take just one quick note back to some of the beginning of Pam Grier, because Jack Hill, obviously, she had worked with in those Women in Prison pictures that they were doing for Roger Corman, The Big Dollhouse and The Big Birdcage, and then they would do Coffee and then Foxy Brown as well together. So there was quite a run. Do you see any carryover from just kind of like what they were doing, what they learned from that world of kind of Roger Corman exploitation cinema that they were bringing into these ones?
Pam actually worked for AIP. And when she came back from the Philippines, she's part Filipino. Jack Hill kind of discovered her, even though she was in Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. Jack Hill kind of put her on the map in those two movies. And he thought that she was a fantastic actor who was also, statuesque and beautiful. That had the one thing that Roger Corman movies needed, which is, fine women and violence, and who could do violence. And so there is carryover, I think, because Jack Hill wrote Coffee specifically for Pam Grier. The AIP said, we need this kind of movie. And Jack Hill said, okay, I can write it, and it was exactly who I want to play this part. And Pam Grier was down to do it. She had done, I think, 8 or 9 movies before Coffee. She had done the two that we mentioned with Jack Hill. She's done Women in Cages. She did The Arena, which is underrated, with Margaret Markoff. Great movie. She has a Triton. She's these female gladiators. Awesome. Lots of fun movie. I think it's edited by Jess Franco. And she had done the Black on White Mom, the Defiant Ones, but with women.
Right, yeah.
Margaret Markoff and Pam Grier have something in common besides being, they have great chemistry on the screen and good friends off screen. They did their own stunts. Because I don't think there are many people who are as big as Margaret Markoff, white women, stunt women, and there were no black stunt people whatsoever. Like 2. So a lot of times Pam Grier would have been, back in Mom and the Hitcher Sucker, been done by a white guy in blackface and a wig. So Pam Grier did her own stunts, and so did Margaret Markoff.
Yeah, and that's something that I think was it Bill Cosby pushed for that, I think, right? When he was doing something where he's just like, I don't want to have a white person doing my stunts.
Spy.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But again, Bill was a man, and there were black male stuntmen in the discipline at the time. Maybe not very many, but they were. So Bill could kind of command that. I want a black stunt person. I don't want some white guy pretending to be me, covered in Jello pudding. No. I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh. No, yeah, it's funny.
But Pam Grier, again, it's so funny because she didn't want to be an actor. She's like, me, an actress? Like, who the hell would want to go see me? In her book, Foxy, she talks about this. And in between movies, she would go back and work at AIP. She was the receptionist. And they're like, Pam, what are you doing here? You're like on the screen. She goes, nah, I'm not
I don't want that.
this. I got to make a paycheck. I got to get money for me to go to, to college and get me, out of here. The coffee, she blew up.
Well, and I think she talks about at some point, as far as like her nude scenes and everything, that she's like, nobody was putting black nipples on the screen. And it was like a chance to actually show black women as an attractive woman. And I think that's, important.
Exactly. And she said the nudity didn't bother her. She said, I'm perfectly fine with this. People with butt naked. In fact, in the arena, when I saw her at TCM Fest, and I mentioned this in the book, when they interviewed her, she talked about the arena. She said she wanted to do her big fight with Margaret Murkoff nude because the African warriors were naked. The kind of Nubian warrior she was playing would have been nude, like the Amazons, would have been, whatever. And she said, see Pam's bush, but the director wouldn't let her do it. She couldn't be, she had to have something covering herself to be on the horse, the bottom of her.
Interesting.
So they didn't shoot her nude, but she was down for it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, she is a fantastic and performer and just a force of nature in these films. So,
oh yeah.
But let's shift gears. You already mentioned Max Julien. So let's shift gears and now start talking about The Mac from 1973, directed by Michael Campus. After his release from prison, Goldie becomes Oakland's most successful pimp, but faces challenges from rivals, the police, and his own conscience. The Mac offers a complex and somewhat controversial exploration of the pimp subculture, highlighting the limited economic opportunities available to many African Americans in urban areas. The film also delves into the psychological and moral conflicts faced by its protagonist as he navigates a world of exploitation and violence. This is a really interesting film, really fascinating, compelling character. How is it using this figure of a pimp character kind of comment on, as we've talked about, the kind of the economic, social realities in the early 70s?
Well, Michael Campus was a documentarian. And so the Mac has a lot of kind of documentary like features to it. If you look at the Dick Anthony Williams and Max Julien play rival pimps. And Williams talks about how he based his character, Pretty Tony, on his brother, who was an actual pimp. And a lot of the violence in the Mac comes from things that actually happened. There's a scene where a guy gets put into a trunk with a bag full of rats. That really happened. Max Julien knew about this. But the Mac was written in prison. The screenwriter of the Mac wrote the screenplay on toilet paper in prison.
Really?
And when he got out, they made this movie, and Richard Pryor allegedly wrote the final draft of the Mac based off this screenplay. Additionally, there was a real gangster, Oakland gangster, who's the opening of the Mac. You see him, a real pimp who Goldie is based upon. And in the movie, Goldie wins the pimp of the player's ball. He beats this guy second place, and the guy is like mad. He's like, I should have been number one. I mean, I'm actually this character. And like, well, this is not your movie.
Yeah, right.
But he was an influence in the middle of the making of the movie. He was shot in the head.
Oh.
And they thought that the Black Panthers had something to do with this. Remember, this is Oakland, so the Black Panthers are there. And they thought the Black Panthers had him assassinated. But truth be told, the Black Panthers didn't have a problem with them making this film. The Black Panthers also promoted, well, not all of them, but certainly a couple of them did promote Sweetback, demanding that if you were going to be in their organization, you had to watch it.
I read that, yeah.
But with the Mac, since it was shot in Oakland, they had the Black Panthers kind of as protection, and they had this guy, the gangster, Frank, who, like I said, was assassinated, was shot. We don't know how he got shot. Who killed him? We don't know. But this happens in the middle of the Mac, of shooting the Mac. And so Max Julien talks about this character, this guy, and he goes, well, he helped us with making him seem real, making everything real in this film. But he was a bad dude.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, he was almost like a Blaxploitation character. He was charming, but he was a snake.
Interesting.
And so Goldie is kind of that kind of character. When you look at his relationship with Roger Mosley's character, Roger Mosley from Magnum P.I., who plays his brother, who was in life but gets out and gets kind of like becomes like almost like a Muslim, but not a Muslim, but someone in that kind of vein.
Right. Yeah.
And has to be drawn back into violence to protect his younger brother. It's kind of a little bit of a tragic side story going on. It doesn't really get much traction when people talk about the Mac. It's interesting. You have Richard Pryor, who is high as a kite It's hard to watch this movie.
Read that, yeah.
Because in every scene, I mean, he's giving you a performance, but it's clear that he is not
completely
elevated.
there. Yeah.
He is high as hell in this movie. But it kind of works with his character. And Richard Pryor knew this world better than a lot of other people. Now, it's interesting. We tie this to Uptight, if I can, for a second.
Yeah.
Max Julien isn't Uptight. Max Julien's mother is played by Juanita Moore, who was the black mother in Imitation of Life, the Douglas Sirk version. Juanita Moore is his mother in the Mac also. Both times her character dies. Now, in the middle of the Mac, Max Julien's mother was murdered.
Oh, geez. That's horrible.
So the scene he plays after Juanita Moore's character dies, I mean, he's playing this with the knowledge that his mother had just been murdered.
Oh.
So it's very difficult when you watch that sequence, how great his acting is, but really he's coming from a place that, is really, really tragic.
That is dark.
It's very, very dark. The back has so much darkness in it, which I think makes it work so well. And of course, lest we forget, his outfit. His outfit is iconic. And then there's the player's ball, which is real.
Well, which I read started because of this film.
Yes.
Yeah.
It started because of this. I have been to the player's ball. I wore a purple suit.
Have you really?
Mm-hmm. And purple alligator shoes and a cane. I went to the player's ball. I had to do it. Once in my life, I had to go to the player's ball.
That's crazy. I would love to think I could wear a purple suit. I don't know if I could pull it off.
Well, you could go to the player's ball. There's white pimps. These famous white pimps, Mr. White Folks. That was the name of one pimp. So, there'll be occasional white pimps. And I think in the player's ball, there's a white pimp in the Mac.
Yeah.
National Players Ball, I believe there is actually a white pimp in that scene. But how Blaxploitation influenced the world is just an example of that. How they influenced the world. This Players Ball became kind of a big thing. And you have Willie Hutch, Motown artist, who is singing the Mac and I Choose You, songs that were sampled years later in hip hop. They have Motown did the label for the Mac soundtrack. Willie Hutch also does Hey Hey Foxy, the Foxy Brown soundtrack. Yeah. He also does the Last Dragons soundtrack in '85.
Does he really?
So it ties to my book talking about how Blaxploitation went underground and re-emerged as the hip hop movie era of the '80s. And it's a little bit of an example there. So Willie Hutch is singing a song about the Mac and I Choose You, and a couple brothers going to work it out on the soundtrack. And you have Max Julien giving a very convincing performance as a pimp, because this is something that these actors knew. But again, Pryor, he grew up in the whorehouse. He's in Peoria. He was around sex workers and pimps and winos and all the things he puts in his comedy. He was very knowledgeable about this world. And like in Lady Sings the Blues, Diana Ross said he taught her how to shoot up, to pretend to shooting up when they made the movie together. So, Pryor, and this is, again, Hollywood didn't know how to use Richard Pryor, but there were occasions where he was used well, like in Lady Sings the Blues, like in JoJo Dancer, like in Uptown Saturday Night, or in Blue Collar, or even in Grease Lightning, which Melvin Van Peebles is one of the writers of. That was directed by Michael Schultz. That came a little bit later. Pam Grier plays his wife in that movie.
Oh, okay. There's always connections. Always connections.
There's always connections. And Michael Campos' next movie was The Education of Sonny Carson, which is a very strange movie about a militant black person. But Campos got in a lot of trouble. People were saying he was exploiting black people in the neighborhood by shooting the Mac. Basically, Max Julien came to his defense about that. But Max Julien, he had an interesting career because in addition to writing Cleopatra Jones, he wrote one of the great underrated Blaxploitation movies, Thomasine and Bushrod.
Oh, I haven't even heard of that one.
Oh, it's great. He's in it. It's Black Bonnie and Clyde. I'm really simplifying this. Vanetta McGee and him.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. When we did the Blaxploitation Baby series at Film Forum, Bruce Goldstein programmed it as part of it for me. I asked him if he could. And I went to see it in the theater. I'd never seen it on the big screen. It was 35 millimeter print. It's a Columbia picture, surprisingly. And I think it's the best of Max Julien's movies that he's in.
Yeah, wow, interesting. Because this one was really good, too.
Oh, the Mac is great. The Mac, again, is iconic in a lot of ways. His outfit.
And his performance was like, he really carries the film. And I mean, to your point of like what we were talking about with these roles, like I can say that about any of the leads through all these films. Like they are all carrying this vibe of just coolness and everything. But I mean, genuinely good performances too, like great actors.
Well, they're all convincing. Yeah, they're all convincing. You can buy Max Julian as this character. You can buy him as the militant and uptight, or as the outlaw on the road of Thomasine and Bushrod. He's got presence, and he put a lot of the producers through the ringer, and he was pretty tough on the Money Man, from my understanding. I think he doesn't really get his due. I mean, the Mac is what most people know, but he had done several other things where I thought he was quite good, both as a writer and as an actor.
Yeah, interesting. I'll have to check more of his stuff out because I don't know if I've seen much else.
Thomasine and Bushrod, you should really watch. It really, really is good. It doesn't have a happy ending because Bonnie and Clyde doesn't have a happy ending, but it's a very interesting Western. There was some good Westerns in Blaxploitation. There's Buck and the Preachers, Take a Hard Ride, the best of the three Jim Kelly, Jim Brown, Fred Williamson movies, which is Take a Hard Ride is my favorite of the three. It answers the question that my cousin and I had as an argument. If Jim Brown and Fred Williamson got into a fight, who would win?
Who'd win?
You get an answer in this movie.
Okay, look at that.
Here's a hint. Fred Williamson, did he direct that one? I think he did. He directed. I think he was one of the writers or producers of the movie. So that gives you an idea who's going to win.
That tells you, right. Yeah, that's very funny. All right, well, we'll be right back, but we're going to talk more about what Blaxploitation has gone on to influence. Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Meet Zinnia.
You are being very polite to someone who is attempting to kill us.
Her wife, Saffron.
You know I'm wildly, madly in love with you.
And their best friend, Goldie.
Glad we didn't miss all the fun.
Swords in hand, they defend their city from the worst of humanity.
I am Lord Buxton Blue.
Equity Electric.
Herr Haig. Virgil Walcott. Vicious Swab.
Follow their adventures on the Swashbuckling Ladies Debate Society audio drama podcast. Available now at truestory.fm/swashbuckling.
This movement, it didn't have a long lifespan, and it peaked, you could say, kind of early, and then it just kind of continued running for a number of years afterward. It's something that certainly, though, has left its mark. It's kind of been a very important touchstone for kind of cinema, popular culture. Let's just start talking about let's start in film. Let's talk about kind of like where it's gone and how this movement's legacy has kind of continued shaping the representation of African Americans in film.
Well, I think, after The Wiz, let's say, kind of killed it, you had a couple of movies.
Which was 78.
78.
Right? Yeah.
You had A Vintage Godfather, which is Woody Ray Moore's David Lynch movie, I like to call it. And you have Penitentiary, Jama Fanaka's movie, that was, prison, where it really technically is somewhat Blaxploitation involved. Then you have those like One Down, Two to Go, which is 81, which is the third collaboration of the two Jims and Fred Williamson. But for the most part, the era kind of went underground. And I think it kind of was reborn in some way as a whole series of hip-hop musical movies that are made in the 80s. Started with Wild Style and going up to Crush Groove and then Last Dragon. And, these movies that were, again, for young black youth to kind of show. And then you get the Black New Wave coming. You have Spike Lee doing She's Gotta Have It in 86, kind of kicking off an entire different kind of series of black directors taking control of movies and making their movies and writing their films and so on and so forth. But if you look at it, the attitudes that Blaxploitation spawned remain. Every time you see a cool character on the screen, how are they denoted as cool? It goes back to the way Blaxploitation denoted them as cool. Whenever you see Samuel L. Jackson, he says, motherfucker, this is a direct link to Blaxploitation. Every time you see a cool black person, there's a music behind them, or they got a nice vines, as they used to call them back in the day, the threads, the clothes they have on, you can take a direct line back to Blaxploitation, a trope in Blaxploitation. So it never really went away. And then you have things like I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. You have things like Black Dynamite, the Outlaw Johnny Black. This let me make a comeback of mocking these films. Well, I'm Gonna Get You Sucker is pretty mean, but it's still funny. It also has the black actors from Blaxploitation mocking themselves, which there's only been one parody of Blaxploitation in the Blaxploitation era. It's called Darktown Strutters. It's weird.
Is it?
Very weird.
But it was so that was a 70s film.
75. It was Stax's last movie. Stax was trying to build a movie empire that Motown had with Lady Sings the Blues and so on. But they couldn't because Stax went bankrupt. And so Watt Stax and Dr. Struthers are the only movie. Oh, and The Klansman, this horrible movie with O.J. Simpson from 1974 and Lee Marvin, which is about, guess what? The Klan. Those are the only movies that Stax had anything to do with. And Dr. Struthers is an acquired taste. I was on a podcast where the people smoke weed, then they watch a movie, and they asked me to make the suggestions of what they should watch. And of course, Dr. Struthers is one of the two suggestions that we spoke about on the show. It's really, really ahead of its time. It's about an abortionist, and it's also about an undercover brother stole this plot, and so did Three to Harvey. Well, Three to Harvey precedes this. There's an evil Colonel Sanders that's poisoning black people with fried chicken in this movie. And then it has three women on motorcycles. It's a slapstick movie. It is batshit. Roger Ebert shockingly reviewed it. He didn't do too many blaxploitation movies. Gene Siskel reviewed every single one of them. But Roger didn't. I don't know why. I wish I'd asked him when he was alive.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But he reviewed Dark Tower Struthers. He was, I don't know what to make of it, but I couldn't stop watching it, so it's worth 2 stars. So that was the only parody that really came out of blaxploitation in the era of this type of thing. I'm going to Get You Sucker is great because you have Isaac Hayes, you have Jim Brown, you have Bernie Casey, you have Antonio Fargas mocking their kind of roles they did in blaxploitation.
And that was late 80s? Is that when that one was?
88,
okay, yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Hollywood Shuffle's 87. That's right before I'm going to Get You Sucker. So it's 88, I believe. I'm going to Get You Sucker is 88.
Gotcha.
Ruth Carter did the costumes for that. I asked her about that when I interviewed her about the costumes for I'm Going to Get You Sucker, especially the one with the fish in the shoes.
This fish, I remember that, yeah.
There was actually a Giants player in the 70s named Frenchy Fuqua, and his platform shoes had fish in them. So Keenan Williams had written that into the script. And when Ruth Carter got the script, she goes, "Oh my God, someone else remembers this."
That is so funny.
And so she made the fish in the shoe.
I remember seeing that as a kid, and I was just like so flabbergasted. Like, how do you take care of them?
How do you walk?
Yeah,
right. I mean, like, how do you walk on those shoes? I mean, I went to see Prince in concert. He had on platform shoes that are about that high.
Yeah,
and he's dancing around doing splits, and I would bust my ass on those shoes.
Yeah,
I'd be dead.
Yeah, no kidding. I'd be no good on that.
So blaxploitation never died. It kind of went into hiding, and then it kind of shows up every so often in a trope or a musical cue or a parody or just the way a person is denoted as cool.
Well, and you mentioned like the characters and stuff. I mean, I'm assuming that the way that you're describing it, we could say that Axel Foley is kind of a thread of a blaxploitation type of character in a Hollywood type of movie.
But he wouldn't have been a cop in the blaxploitation movie. He would have been like either like Shaft, or he'd have just been like the character he's in Trading Places, where he's a hustler who happens to get involved in this. He wouldn't be a cop in blaxploitation, but yeah, he's the coolest thing in Beverly Hills Cop, and he's constantly sticking it to the white folks. So yeah.
Is there, as far as the kind of representation of African Americans in mainstream cinema, blaxploitation seemed to really kind of increase the visibility overall of Black characters and stories in Hollywood. I mean, talk about how it really kind of paved the way for other filmmakers and actors. I mean, we're talking about this with Sinners, kind of like #1 film at the box office for a number of weeks now. I feel like that film is here because of this movement that really kind of led the way.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have jobs because of for Black folks, you talk about the shoulders that we're standing on. Someone had to do this. Some before Sidney Poitier, there was Paul Robeson, there was Canada Lee. And Sidney Poitier talks about that, without Paul Robeson, without Canada Lee, I wouldn't be here. They wouldn't have cast me. They wouldn't have put me there. And a lot of people say without Denzel says it, I would say Denzel's my generation's Sidney, but my generation had Sidney. So he say, I'm standing on the shoulders of Sidney Poitier and on everybody else that came before him. And then people are going to say that, Ryan Coogler is standing on the shoulders of Gordon Parks, of Ossie Davis, of Melvin Van Peebles, of Bill Gunn. These people who were the first 4 Black people to direct a movie in Hollywood. They're standing on the shoulders of Oscar Michelle and Spencer Williams and a bunch of other folks that were making race films back in the day. So you can draw that parallel, that back and forth to these people. And so without them, they may not exist. So they may exist in a different fashion, if at all. And you have Blackula, obviously Black Vampire, which is too easy to make a correlation to Sinners. But in actuality, there is some kind of tie to the idea of having a Black vampire. Without Blackula, he was the first Black vampire. Would they have kind of given thought to having a Black vampire? Tarantino turned Fred Williamson into a vampire from Dusk Till Dawn, which is a bigger influence on Sinners. Even in the construction of Sinners, it kind of is constructed like From Dusk Till Dawn as well. And then Ryan Coogler's on record saying that was one of his influences. So not just starring, it's a white director's movie. Well, also it's not a white director, it's Robert Rodriguez. At Sinners, there's, you're influenced by many different things. But again, Ryan Coogler exists, and he was able to direct Black Panther because he made Fruitvale Station. He made Fruitvale Station because Spike Lee started out by directing She's Gotta Have, a little small movie. And Fruitvale Station was a little small movie that someone was willing to take a chance on. But so it does tie together. I'm not saying that one is better than the other or that it wouldn't exist without the other, but I can't imagine that, happening.
No. Yeah. I can see Robert Rodriguez's film probably being more of an influence than something like A Vampire in Brooklyn, another Black vampire.
Oh, Vampire in Brooklyn is terrible. Even if Eddie Murphy, even if Charlie Murphy wrote Vampire in Brooklyn. Vampire in Brooklyn is god awful. And Wes Craven, why Wes? I made a joke about, if you think Nick Ashford is scary, because he looks like Nick Ashford in that movie. I'm like, Nick Ashford becomes a vampire. So New Jack City, we should mention, which is directed by Mario Van Peebles, is, it's a combination Blaxploitation movie and a Warner Brothers gangster movie. In fact, I wrote a piece on New Jack City, and my title is a Warner Brothers gangsta with an A movie. You can see kind of the Black Caesar and some of these other movies kind of influence, and even Sweetback influences New Jack City, which is 91.
Right. Yeah.
Wesley Snipes, who should have been Oscar nominated for that role, Nino Brown. Look at these characters that you never forget. It has a tie. I mean, it would have been a Blaxploitation movie. It was made in 1974.
Do you, just as another director that I'm thinking about, like somebody like Bill Duke, is he somebody that you would say has been kind of like on the shoulders of, as far as like what he's been doing?
Literally, Bill Duke will tell you he's on the shoulders of Ivan Dixon.
Okay. Ivan
Dixon and Bill Duke were in Car Wash together, you may recall. Ivan Dixon came out of retirement to play Lonnie in Car Wash. I saw Car Wash last week at they were honoring Michael Schultz at TCM Film Festival, and they showed a couple of his movies, one of which is Car Wash. Ivan Dixon had directed Trouble Man and A Spook Who Sat by the Door. By the time he got to Car Wash, he had left acting. He was on Hogan's Heroes. He was in Nothing But a Man, a couple other movies. He left acting to direct. And when Bill Duke and Ivan Dixon were in Car Wash, Bill Duke said that Ivan Dixon told him he should direct movies. He should go into directing.
Interesting. That's where it came from.
And eventually, Bill Duke wound up in directing. He directed a Chester Harlan movie, Rage in Harlem, for starters. And then he directed Deep Cover, which is a fantastic movie, which easily could have been a Blaxploitation movie.
Yeah. I think that's what's so fascinating is like, you can really see how it's resonated in all of this contemporary discussions in film about race, about representation, empowerment. And I think that it's something that where the legacy has really kind of informed a lot of the conversation that we're having in these films today.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've already talked a little bit about some of the problems and everything. Obviously, when you look back at films in the 70s, it's important to kind of just often remember it's of its era and everything. But some critics still argue that there's a perpetuation of these stereotypes, looking back at it, I suppose, in the scope of like looking at problematic aspects of things like that. Is there a lens that we should look at some of this and just kind of acknowledge what's there? You talked about like a particular moment, for example, in Coffee that is just like still is something that is too much for you. Sweetback, let's just say, starts with one of the most horrific.
The opening of Sweetback is incredibly,
Yeah.
It's still banned and you can't show that scene in the UK.
Well, I'm surprised it's not censored elsewhere. It was a little too much for me. It's a tough thing to look at.
Mario Van Peebles' debut.
Oh, jeez.
And in Baadassss, the movie he made where he plays his father, it's a great story that when he decided to buy the rights to Sweetback's Guerrilla's Manifesto, which Melvin made him pay for it. He's like, "You're my son, but you're going to buy the rights to my book." There's a famous story of Melvin Van Peebles, when he made The Watermelon Man, he had 2 kids and a wife. He had taken an aborter to help him pay for his bills. And his wife said, what would you say if I told you that I was screwing the aborter? And he said, I would raise his rent. So Melvin made his son pay for the rights to his book.
Oh my gosh.
Then
Wow.
Melvin asked, well, who's going to play me? And Mario, who looks just like his father, said, I'm going to play you. And Melvin said, okay, well, don't make me too nice.
Wow.
And if you watch Baadassss, the movie that Mario made from this, which I thought was the best movie of 2000, is a fascinating film. Is the kid from Holes play him in the scene in Sweetback, the opening scene. And he kind of has to deal with the repercussions of how that made him feel. So he's playing his father. He's pushing this kid to do the sex scene. And it's depicted in the movie, and it's kind of implicit, but you kind of see Mario kind of working his way through this. I know I say it's not traumatic, but his feelings about having to be in that movie, doing what he did.
Yeah, the psychology, right? Yeah. Huh, fascinating. I'm assuming it's the kid who played Zero in
Yes.
Holes. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
That kid is fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. But I mean, just kind of continuing this thread, though, as far as like acknowledging these problematic aspects that we have, I mean, and I suppose it's part of the nature of like, criticism and a critical eye looking at films in general. But is there an approach that people should take as they look at this, as some of these elements?
Well, I think you need to at least look at it from the context of the time in which it was made. I talk about this all the time. Being a Black fan of movies is hard, especially if you're a fan of classic movies like I am. Because if you look at all these Hollywood movies, whenever someone looks like me shows up, immediately you tense. You're like, what are they going to do? Are they going to step and fetch it? Are they going to just be a maid? Yes, a boss. Or are they going to be, a racist stereotype? Unless it's Sidney Poitier or Ozzie Davis or Ruby Dee, where you be sure won't do any of this, you're not really sure what's going to happen when they show up. Or if they're in the movie at all. And so you have to really look at it from the perspective of, okay, well, there's that really hideous dance number in the Affair to Remember, but overall, the movie's still somewhat romantic. You have 2 thoughts in your head. You can say that this particular element is bad, but you also have to acknowledge that they would have put that kind of thing in the movie in 1958, and it would have been okay. It's like you can have all these movies with the N-word in the title that Fred Williamson did on purpose. He said it was controversy, so he always do that. There's 4 movies of the N-word in them, all westerns that he made, and they changed them to Legend of Black Charlie and Legend of the Soul of Black Charlie, and show them on TCM, the boss N-word is just called boss. You could do that. And not to say that it was right or wrong, but it was accepted. So that's one thing you have to think about when you look at these movies. At the same time, you're perfectly within your right to be offended. And if your offense is not new, when I talk about the Coalition Against Blaxploitation in my book, the first thing I say to you is your offense is not new. They were protesting these movies when they came out. So you didn't just stumble upon and have a self-righteous reaction to it. People precede you, and your offense is not new. So you can be offended. But, I'm a genre person, so I love horror movies. I love trashy exploitation movies. So I may be a little more hardened to some of the more salacious and nastier elements of this type of thing, but I will completely acknowledge, some of this stuff is rough. I mean, especially later in the Blaxploitation, you get things like the Candy Tangerine Man, which is one of the vilest of all the movies that I've seen. And then you also have to kind of deal with the way that these movies dealt with, say, gay characters. Shaft, the 1971 Shaft is more forward about homosexuality than the remake of 2019. In Shaft 1971, he goes to the No Name Bar, the gay bartender Raleigh. He asked him to take over the bar so he can find the Italian guys from Philly that are looking for him. And if you pay attention, Raleigh, who was this flamingly gay bartender at the bar, he pats Richie Roundtree on the ass.
Right.
And he says, good luck. And Roundtree Shaft doesn't flinch.
Doesn't react, yeah.
He doesn't flinch. He's like, okay, fine. There's nothing wrong with this character. It's one of the great lines in Shaft as well. But in the remake of Shaft, Samuel Jackson is constantly berating his son and calling him, a girl because he's a computer guy. And this toxic masculinity, especially in the Black community, there's this element that kind of is that you must be like, super macho. Otherwise, you're sissy, you're this, you're that. And so that look at these movies, you have to kind of take into account, let's say like in in Friday Foster, Godfrey Cambridge plays this mincing, gay fashion designer whose nemesis is Eartha Kitt, and who winds up getting crushed in a telephone. Well, he is the most violent murderer in Friday Foster.
Oh, jeez.
And then you get something like The Human Tornado, where Rudy Ray Moore, who allegedly was gay, has all these full frontal nude Black guys sliding down a slide, butt naked. And you're like, did you not notice this how homoerotic this was? See, again, you have to look at it in the context of the time it was made. You could have a mincing gay stereotype back then. I'm not saying it was right, but you have to kind of put that into perspective that, okay, they did this. And again, you could be offended. This is how I watch things. It doesn't mean I won't be offended. Because there's plenty of stuff that offended me in some of these movies that I actually still manage to like. I have this whole list of movies that I love, but I would never recommend to anybody. That sounds like a good article. Some critics should write this.
No kidding.
Movies that I love, but I would never recommend to anybody because you'd probably like kick me or slap me in the head or think I was some kind of pervert or, misogynist or whatever. Movies art is provocative. Art is designed to provoke.
That's what I was going to say. I think it speaks to the art, really, that these filmmakers were pushing. It's not just kind of like Hollywood cookie cutter formulas that they were working with. They're like, how can we push? How can we provoke? How can we make people think? And I think that is what the best art is doing. And I think they were really speaking to that with the way that they were constantly pushing at the boundaries.
Great. But keep in mind, there were also some dramas that were working, as Blaxploitation adjacent things, or even part of Blaxploitation. You have Cooley High, for example, which is a really good movie about Black high school students that was written by Eric Monti based on his experiences. Eric Monti was one of the creators of Good Times. And he also created the Jeffersons for All in the Family. This script created George Jefferson and Wheezy for All in the Family. You have things like Claudine, which is my favorite romantic comedy of all time, that exists in the Blaxploitation era, that has elements of, living in this neighborhood, the same kind of neighborhood you find in a Blaxploitation movie, but is Blaxploitation adjacent. You have Latencies, The Blues, and Sounder. But what happened with Blaxploitation was once the controversy really started to arise, they started to try to make movies that are more like preachy, like Amazing Grace of Miles Mabley. Now, Miles Mabley is one of the dirtiest comedians that ever lived. They put him in a G-rated movie. It was horrible. So they started trying to make these movies that lectured the Black youth, and they didn't want a sermon. They wanted tits and ass and violence. They go to church on Sunday. And that was kind of what started to bring the Blaxploitation genre down, in addition to movies that just focus on the more salacious elements, just the sex and killing the entire movie. So, that's kind of what the quality of those movies kind of suffered because of that.
I wonder if there's an element of that where it's Hollywood also looking at it and going, well, how can we work on making these for everybody? Like, how can we appeal to the white audience too? I mean, was there an element of that?
Well, I think it's Hollywood thought the wrong things made the movies work. They focused on the wrong elements of the movies to try to make them work. So by the time Dolomite came along, and I love Dolomite as bad as it is, it cost 49 cents, but I love it anyway. And Human Tornado as well. By the time you came to these things, the system was starting to really crack. And we were starting to get a lot of bad movies. And then Jaws came out, and then Star Wars came out, and then you had Roots on television, and then you get The Wiz. So again, Hollywood was only going to give you money if your movie makes money. And you don't get a lot of chances. Women don't get a lot of chances. Gay people don't get a lot of chances. You make a movie, you're a gay person, you make a gay movie, it doesn't make money, Hollywood's not going to give you any more.
Yeah, that's it.
Even today, it's the same way as it was 50 years ago. You have a harder hill to climb if you are a person of color or you're not straight.
Well, and I mean, not to go on a whole different tangent, but I mean, the studio system has shifted so much anyway, as far as like the franchises and really what they're looking for is a totally different thing now anyway, right?
Right. No, it is. And it's not, again, the franchises again are still cookie cutter, and they're still mostly looking to speak to white audiences. But you like Black Panther, and Black Panther being a huge success really gave Ryan Coogler, and Creed too, which Creed, the first one, it was my #1 movie of the year. As a fan of Rocky movies, Creed, and I love boxing movies in general, but Creed was an example of a Black creative taking something they loved and kind of reforming in their own image. But Stallone gives one of the best performances of his career in Creed. He got the Oscar nomination. I thought he deserved to win it. That's a fascinating movie. So Sinner is fascinating for Coogler in that it's his chance to finally do something in his mind that is so personal and completely original that he demanded he got the rights back in 25 years. So again, he's kind of like stepping up to doing this type of things. And you go back to the Blaxploitation era, a lot of people still had careers after the era was over. Some of them did not, but Pam Grier is still around. Fred Williamson is still around. Yavocado, all these people, they went on to make other movies. Yavocado's an Alien, for example.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then there are people who are Richard Roundtree. His last movie was Thelma, which is fantastic. He was so good in that movie. And his movie before that was he was married to Jane Fonda. And I was like, Shaft and Barbarella doing it.
It's fantastic.
So these people had careers afterward they may not have had they not appeared in some of these films.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation about this movement. Odie, thank you so much for joining me to talk about all of this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Talk a little bit about you and what you're up to, and let's plug your book also.
Oh, yes. My book, Black Seals, The Foxy Cleopatras, A History of Blaxploitation Cinema, is available everywhere. If you ever enjoy listening to my melodious voice, you can hear me read it to you because I do the audiobook as well.
Hey, fantastic.
So you can hear me read it to you or you can read it yourself, and it's available everywhere. And at this particular recording, I am still the film critic of the Boston Globe. So, and that's why I make a comment about Trump and he has me fired.
Yeah, right.
So I'm at the Boston Globe. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on the Insta and I'm on Blue Sky. Alienated, not Blue Sky, BSKY, the social, you'll find me. I'm not on Twitter, thank God.
Yeah, right.
Coming up, I'm just trying to pitch another book and keep your fingers crossed, see what happens.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have links for all of your socials and definitely the book, which people definitely should pick up. It's a great book. Really enjoying the read. And that'll all be in the show notes. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. Music by Orcus and Stefano Mastronardi. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film podcasts at truestory.fm. Follow us on social media at The Next Reel, and please rate and review us if your podcast app allows. As we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.